The concept of historical canon, what is accepted, reproduced, and taught as the record of the past rests upon the implicit assumption that documentation is both accurate and impartial. This assumption remains largely unchallenged in popular understanding, despite increasing evidence that the construction of history is a deeply political act. What is left out, misrepresented, or selectively emphasized carries equal, if not greater, weight than what is formally included. To interrogate the integrity of the historical canon, one must examine not only what is written, but also who wrote it, under what circumstances, and for which audiences. In the medieval period, these questions intersected with the rise of intelligence networks, religious orthodoxy, and the centralization of power, all of which conspired, intentionally or structurally, to distort the archival record. History in its medieval formulation was not a disinterested endeavor. Chroniclers served kings, bishops, abbots, and generals, not the abstract ideals of accuracy or balance. The scribal economy, limited to monastic scriptoria, palace libraries, and ecclesiastical archives, inherently favored the priorities of those in control of such institutions. It is not coincidental that dissenting voices, heretics, apostates, philosophical radicals, or vanquished enemies seldom appear on their own terms in medieval documentation. Instead, they are described by their adversaries, portrayed as threats to orthodoxy or order, and often reduced to caricatures. The mechanisms of this reduction were not accidental. They were often facilitated by emerging structures of surveillance, censorship, and information control that now resemble the framework of a proto-intelligence apparatus. From the 9th century onward, a pattern emerges in which access to scriptural authority, legal precedent, and philosophical legitimacy became tightly controlled through ecclesiastical and royal institutions. These authorities invested in the physical infrastructure of knowledge, production, scriptoria, chancelleries, and councils that formalized what could be said and remembered. Within these spaces, the past was not merely copied, it was shaped. Marginal notes were added, passages altered, inconsistencies harmonized, and alternative accounts suppressed. Under such conditions, the canon became an artifact of power, not a neutral reflection of prior reality. This script does not approach the question of medieval historical distortion through the lens of conspiracy. Rather, it proceeds through a forensic examination of archival practices, institutional incentives, and documented irregularities in the historical record. The hypothesis under investigation is not whether there was a single, coordinated effort to rewrite history, but whether overlapping networks of religious, political, and paramilitary actors used the tools at their disposal to manipulate what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. The implication is systemic rather than conspiratorial. When power is concentrated, so too is the authority to define reality. Key to this analysis is the understanding that intelligence, even in its pre-modern form, did not merely function to gather information, it functioned to influence, disrupt, and reshape perception. In the medieval period, information was more scarce and more sacred than in any subsequent epoch. Monopolizing it meant controlling the basis on which people understood their world. The Church, for example, did not merely guard doctrine. It defined the parameters of truth. Heresy was not simply an error, it was a threat to the cosmological and social order. In this context, rewriting history was not just a possibility. It was a necessity for institutions seeking to maintain legitimacy, coherence, and control. The emergence of semi-secret networks, whether the Ismaili assassins of Persia, the Templar archives in Europe, or the Byzantine espionage routes along the Silk Road, cannot be viewed in isolation. These groups operated within a matrix of authority that understood the power of secrecy, surveillance, and strategic erasure. Where documentation existed, it was curated. Where counter-narratives threatened to surface, they were neutralized through excommunication, execution, or oblivion. The institutionalization of memory was paralleled by the institutionalization of forgetting. To establish a framework for this investigation, it is necessary to question the assumptions that underpin the received narrative of the medieval world. Modern historiography tends to privilege documentary sources, but if those sources were themselves subject to alteration, suppression, or strategic fabrication, then the conclusions drawn from them must be reevaluated. This inquiry begins from the premise that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, particularly in an era where destruction, not preservation, was often the tool of control, much of what we consider foundational to medieval history. Church councils, crusades, royal lineages, theological debates are known only through documents produced and preserved by the victors. This imbalance demands scrutiny. It is not sufficient to catalog these documents. One must interrogate their provenance, context, and omissions. What voices are consistently excluded? What patterns of erasure suggest deliberate intervention? What archives are no longer extant, and under what circumstances were they destroyed? This first section sets the stage for an extensive investigation into the mechanics by which medieval institutions preserved, manipulated, and sometimes fabricated the historical record. It does not presuppose a single architect behind the distortion of history. Instead, it proposes a model of systemic influence in which multiple actors, clerical, military, and clandestine, had overlapping incentives to conceal, obscure, or redefine elements of the past. The objective is not to recover an authentic version of history, but to expose the architecture of secrecy that conditioned what we have come to accept as historical truth. By tracing the convergence of monastic scribes, papal diplomats, covert assassins, and imperial archivists. The sections that follow will build a cumulative case that the medieval period was not only a time of conflict and consolidation, but a battleground of memory where archives were forged not only from parchment and ink, but from fear, doctrine, and the calculated void. To understand how medieval institutions could manipulate history, one must first comprehend the epistemological framework of the period, the medieval episteme. In contrast to modern conceptions of knowledge as empirical, provisional, and subject to revision, the medieval model emphasized revelation, hierarchy, and immutability. Knowledge was not discovered but received, not questioned but transmitted. It flowed from divine authority through authorized intermediaries, clerics, scholars, monarchs, and was validated not by experimentation but by correspondence with accepted tradition. Within this context, control over information was not merely practical. It was metaphysical. This rigid structure enabled a small class of gatekeepers to monopolize the tools of literacy, record-keeping, and teaching. Literacy in the medieval West was largely confined to clerical elites whose roles straddled the spiritual and administrative domains. The Church's authority over education, scripture, and moral doctrine placed it at the center of what could be known, what should be forgotten, and what must never be spoken. While secular rulers wielded armies, it was the Church that governed the realm of ideas. In this configuration, intellectual deviation was treated not only as disobedience, but as heresy, as sin with eternal consequences. The epistemological verticality of the medieval worldview rendered dissent structurally invisible. It could be punished, but it could not be integrated. Those who diverged from canonical teaching were exiled from intellectual legitimacy. Importantly, this exclusion was not only enforced through public trials or physical coercion. It was embedded in the mechanisms of record-keeping. Scribes who copied manuscripts were trained to suppress anomalies, harmonize contradictions, and excise apocryphal or heterodox material. This process, repeated over generations, created a recursive epistemology in which only orthodoxy was preserved. And orthodoxy was defined by what had been preserved. This dynamic was reinforced by the theology of history that dominated medieval thought. History was not seen as a series of contingent events subject to human interpretation. but as a providential narrative whose meaning was embedded by divine design. Thus, any deviation from the sanctioned version of events was not simply an alternative perspective but a blasphemous affront to divine truth. This theological underpinning legitimized acts of suppression as sacred duties. To destroy a heterodox text was not censorship, it was purification. To rewrite a historical account in favor of the dominant order was not forgery, it was restoration. The formalization of ecclesiastical orthodoxy, particularly after the Carolingian Renaissance and into the High Middle Ages, elevated this control to an institutional level. Councils, synods, and decretals codified doctrine while simultaneously determining what historical accounts would be deemed authoritative. The educational reforms of Charlemagne, for example, ostensibly intended to raise literacy, ultimately reinforced central control by standardizing the curriculum and concentrating interpretive authority in clerical hands. The result was a highly stratified system in which access to texts, let alone their production, was tightly regulated. Simultaneously, the rise of royal bureaucracies mirrored ecclesiastical models. As monarchies grew more centralized, especially in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, so too did their reliance on written records to validate legal and dynastic claims. Royal charters, annals, and genealogies became tools of legitimacy, and their production was entrusted to trained scribes embedded within the court apparatus. These scribes were not impartial chroniclers. They were political functionaries, often selected for their loyalty rather than their accuracy. The alignment of state power and record-keeping further narrowed the scope of permissible historical memory. Another significant aspect of the medieval episteme was its handling of contradictory evidence. Whereas modern historiography might interpret conflicting accounts as an invitation to critical inquiry, the medieval mindset prioritized harmonization. Apparent contradictions were resolved by eliminating the less authoritative source or by reconciling inconsistencies through allegorical interpretation. This approach not only protected the integrity of the canon, but also insulated it from revision. Once a narrative was enshrined, its internal coherence was safeguarded through textual manipulation rather than intellectual openness. The consequences of this control were far-reaching. Events that challenged the dominant political or theological narratives were either omitted entirely from the historical record or recast in language that neutralized their subversive potential. Victories of heterodox groups were reinterpreted as divine tests of faith. Popular uprisings were dismissed as satanic delusions. Cultural exchanges with Islamic or pagan civilizations were downplayed or condemned. Through such practices, the boundaries of legitimate history were drawn and rigorously defended. This epistemic regime extended into the practical realm of information management. Surveillance was not institutionalized in the modern sense, but a culture of reporting, suspicion, and confession created a self-regulating system in which deviation was often preemptively suppressed. Whisper networks, inquisitorial interrogations, and parish records functioned as rudimentary forms of intelligence gathering. What information could be collected was uneven and often indirect, but its circulation was deliberately limited. Manuscripts were copied by hand in limited numbers, and their distribution was subject to gatekeeping by abbots, bishops, and censors. Under these conditions, the act of writing history took on a quasi-liturgical quality. Chroniclers were not merely reporting events. They were participating in a sacramental act that affirmed the cosmic order. This spiritualization of historiography further inhibited the inclusion of dissenting accounts. Even when such accounts existed, they were often relegated to marginalia, buried within appendices or written in ambiguous terms to avoid censure. Over time, many of these peripheral voices disappeared altogether, either lost through neglect or actively destroyed. Thus, the medieval episteme did not merely enable information control, it demanded it. To question the canonical version of events was to question the divine order itself. This structural alignment of theology, politics, and historiography created an environment in which historical manipulation could flourish, not through covert conspiracy, but through institutional orthodoxy. The mechanisms were visible, but their implications were obscured by the very logic that justified them. In this landscape, intelligence networks, whether ecclesiastical, diplomatic, or clandestine, functioned as extensions of a deeper epistemic imperative to maintain order through control of meaning. Their activities were not anomalies, but expressions of a broader paradigm in which knowledge was a resource to be monopolized, shaped, and where necessary erased. The preservation of medieval history owes an enormous debt to monastic institutions. Monasteries were not only centers of prayer and contemplation, they were the primary custodians of written culture. The scriptorium, a space within monasteries where manuscripts were copied, was the nucleus of historical memory, theological consolidation, and political legitimation. These centers, particularly under the influence of Benedictine and later Cistercian orders, became powerful curators of knowledge. Yet the question arises, were these monastic archives passive preservers of historical truth, or active agents in shaping a narrative aligned with institutional priorities? In practice, the answer leans toward the latter. Monastic communities functioned within strict hierarchies, both internally and within the broader ecclesiastical structure. Their role as producers and curators of written material gave them unique influence over what was remembered and what faded into oblivion. The act of copying a manuscript was never ideologically neutral. Decisions had to be made regarding what to transcribe, what to omit, and how to reconcile variant sources. These decisions were rarely spontaneous or purely aesthetic. They were guided by theological orthodoxy, ecclesiastical pressure, and practical considerations of space, labor, and political acceptability. The physical construction of archives further reinforced these hierarchies. Libraries were often segregated into sections based on utility and authority. Authoritative texts, typically church fathers, approved histories, and canonical scripture occupied central locations and received the highest degree of care and reproduction. Works deemed peripheral, problematic, or heretical were excluded, destroyed, or poorly maintained. Over time, this differential treatment created a structural bias in the surviving record. What remained intact was not necessarily what was most widely read or debated, but what was most aligned with institutional values. The Benedictine model, following the rule of Saint Benedict, emphasized obedience, stability, and conversion of life. These values translated into a conservatism in textual transmission. The Benedictines, who dominated European monastic life from the 8th to the 12th centuries, operated under papal protection and were deeply integrated into feudal and ecclesiastical power structures. Their scriptoria became the loci of manuscript production for religious and secular patrons alike. In this position, they exerted silent but significant control over how history was recorded, especially regarding dynastic succession, theological disputes, and historical events involving the Church. The later emergence of the Cistercian reform did not radically alter this structure. While Cistercians initially criticized the opulence and laxity of Benedictine houses, they too embraced a disciplined textual culture that prioritized clarity, orthodoxy, and institutional coherence. Their records, though often more austere, adhered to the same logic. History was a tool for edification, reinforcement of authority, and regulation of belief. Heretical movements such as the Cathars and the Waldensians are conspicuously absent from Cistercian accounts until they posed a direct threat. Even then, their portrayals are filtered through theological condemnation rather than analytical engagement. The power of monastic archives was compounded by their exclusivity. These institutions were closed to the general population, and access to their texts was tightly controlled. Books were chained to lecterns, guarded within locked chests, and lent only under strict conditions, if at all. Illiteracy among the wider population ensured that monks were not only the producers, but also the interpreters of historical narratives. This asymmetry of access meant that alternative views, oral histories, and regional variations were often excluded from the documentary record unless filtered through a clerical lens. Moreover, the process of manuscript copying introduced multiple opportunities for editorial intervention. Scribes did not always replicate their sources verbatim. Marginal notes became embedded in the main text over successive reproductions. Interpretative glosses took on authoritative status. Errors were corrected in ways that reflected prevailing doctrinal views. Over generations, these subtle adjustments could significantly alter the tone, focus, and content of a text. In some cases, entire sections were interpolated or excised to bring older documents into line with newer theological positions or political realities. The example of historical chronicles is particularly instructive. Chronicles, ostensibly written to record the passage of time and notable events, were rarely objective. They often reflected the interests of their patrons, whether ecclesiastical or royal, and presented events in a framework of divine providence. Victories were interpreted as signs of God's favor, defeats as punishments for moral failings. The role of chroniclers was not merely to inform, but to moralize and legitimize. As many of these chroniclers were monks, their accounts became embedded in the very archives they helped create. This self-reinforcing cycle of writing, preserving, interpreting, and reproducing created what might be termed an ecclesiastical memory loop. Alternative narratives, whether rooted in folk tradition, oral transmission, or foreign sources, were rarely integrated unless domesticated to fit the prevailing interpretive schema. The library thus became a closed circuit. It preserved what it valued and valued what it preserved. The destruction of texts further exacerbated this phenomenon. Heretical works were subject to public burning. Pagan literature, unless Christianized, was neglected or discarded. Even classical texts were selectively copied and often altered to eliminate content deemed dangerous or subversive. The result is an archive shaped as much by absence as by presence. The gaps in the record are not random. They reflect deliberate choices made over centuries to enforce a particular view of the world. Monastic archivists, far from being neutral custodians, operated within a system that aligned historical memory with institutional stability. Their role in shaping what survived into modernity cannot be overstated. They were not spies in the modern sense, but they functioned with similar discretion and selectivity. Their decisions determined which events would be known, which figures would be remembered, and which ideologies would endure. In this light, the monastic archive becomes not a repository of truth, but a curated reflection of power. As we move deeper into this investigation, these dynamics raise critical questions. Can the integrity of a historical record be maintained when its curators were structurally incentivized to suppress dissent and reinforce hierarchy? Is it possible to reconstruct lost or altered narratives from the fragments that remain? And most significantly, if archives were constructed under these conditions, how can they serve as reliable foundations for modern historiography? The medieval period witnessed the development of a number of religious, military, and clandestine organizations that operated across regional, political, and theological boundaries. These were not merely religious orders with military functions. They were multifaceted entities involved in diplomacy, finance, espionage, and archival control. The emergence of such orders occurred within a context where the monopoly over information was increasingly linked to geopolitical power. Among these, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Nizari Ismailis, often labeled the assassins in Western sources, stand out for their hybrid structures and ambiguous affiliations. Their activities present a critical juncture in the evolution of intelligence as both practice and architecture. The Knights Templar, officially founded in the early 12th century, began as a monastic order with the task of protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. Yet their transformation was rapid. Within decades, they became one of the most powerful transnational institutions in Christendom, with extensive landholdings, independent legal privileges, and their own logistical infrastructure. Crucially, they operated outside the direct jurisdiction of local monarchs and bishops, answering only to the Pope. This autonomy, rare for the period, allowed them to develop independent archives, secret rituals, and a code of internal discipline that mirrored clandestine intelligence services. The Templars' financial system, which included safekeeping of deposits and the issuance of letters of credit, also functioned as an intelligence network. In order to ensure the safe transfer of funds across regions plagued by war, piracy, and feudal conflict, the Templars had to maintain updated knowledge of road conditions, political changes, local alliances, and military threats. Their system of commanderies, regional headquarters distributed across Europe and the Levant, served not only as administrative centers, but also as nodes of communication and surveillance. Couriers traveled between them carrying sealed instructions and encoded directives. Though the full details of their encryption techniques remain unknown, references in surviving documents suggest a culture of secrecy grounded in strict internal hierarchies and compartmentalization. Similarly, the Knights Hospitaller, while founded with a focus on medical care and hospitality, developed military and diplomatic functions that eventually paralleled the Templars. As they expanded their influence, especially after the fall of the Crusader states, the Hospitallers became involved in naval operations and territorial governance, particularly on Rhodes and later Malta. Their archives included detailed records of shipping routes, political negotiations, and internal disciplinary proceedings. Like the Templars, their capacity for intelligence collection was embedded in their structural dispersion, religious immunity, and operational mobility. The Nizari Ismailis, more commonly known in Western historiography as the Assassins, present a different but equally significant model. Operating from fortified mountain citadels in Persia and Syria, notably Alamet, they constructed an organization that prioritized secrecy, ideological cohesion, and surgical violence. Western accounts, shaped by Crusader chroniclers and later European writers, often exaggerated their mystique, but the underlying structure of the order reflected a rational system of influence. They maintained a network of trained operatives who carried out selective assassinations of political and religious figures considered threats to the Ismaili cause. These actions were not indiscriminate. They were carefully chosen to achieve maximum symbolic and political impact. The Nizari order's internal communication system relied on oral transmission, coded language, and strict hierarchical control. While written documents were used sparingly, their libraries reportedly held philosophical, theological, and tactical treatises that were destroyed or confiscated during later conquests. The strategic targeting of enemies, often in public and dramatic ways, served to create a deterrent effect disproportionate to the Nizari's numerical or territorial strength. Their power lay in perception, in creating the impression that they had access to secret knowledge, unlimited reach, and theological justification for their actions. What unites these orders is their development of an operational model that integrated spiritual authority, military organization, and information control. They were neither mere militias nor simple religious sects. Instead, they embodied a form of medieval proto-intelligence apparatus, autonomous, networked, and ideologically driven. The blend of religious legitimacy and practical function enabled them to access elite spaces, maintain independent records, and manipulate perception. These orders operated across linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries, giving them a pan-regional perspective unavailable to most medieval institutions. Their existence posed both a practical and epistemological challenge to the dominant powers of their time. Monarchs and popes tolerated them when useful and suppressed them when threatened. The eventual dissolution of the Templars in the early 14th century, following accusations of heresy and treason, is a case in point. The charges against them, many of which involved secret rituals, encrypted communication, and concealed wealth, reflected a deeper anxiety about their independence and opacity. The trial that followed was as much about control over information as it was about criminal behavior. Much of their archive was destroyed, and what survives is fragmented and often filtered through hostile sources. Similarly, the Nizari Ismailis were targeted by both Sunni orthodoxy and Mongol aggression. The destruction of Alamet and its libraries obliterated a significant portion of their intellectual legacy. Western narratives, constructed largely from enemy accounts, reduced them to a stereotype of fanatical assassins, obscuring the complexity of their ideology and the sophistication of their operations. These orders also participated in the preservation and distortion of history. Their archives, rituals, and training manuals, whether lost or censored, were part of a parallel record that seldom made it into official ecclesiastical or royal annals. Where they did appear, it was often in the context of condemnation, myth, or conspiracy. Their portrayal was shaped not by internal testimony, but by the anxieties and agendas of external observers. Thus, they became repositories not only of secret knowledge, but of projected fears, both real and invented. The emergence of these cryptic orders introduces a new dimension to the investigation of medieval historical distortion. If archives were manipulated by the church and royal courts, they were also contested by semi-independent actors operating within different epistemological and political frameworks. These organizations, by virtue of their secrecy and trans-regional scope, complicate the binary of official versus suppressed history. They represent a third category, the curated unknown. What they knew, recorded, or destroyed may never be fully recovered, but their presence must be accounted for in any critical examination of how the medieval record was constructed, guarded, and disrupted. Among all the medieval entities associated with clandestine activity, none have been subjected to as much speculation and distortion as the Nizari Ismailis, often labeled by Crusader and later European chroniclers as the assassins. This term, rooted in pejorative and possibly apocryphal interpretations, has obscured the functional and structural complexity of the Ismaili network. Far from being a chaotic cult of killers, the Nizari system represented a disciplined, ideologically cohesive, and strategically sophisticated apparatus. It operated with precision and intent within a volatile geopolitical environment shaped by sectarian strife, Crusader incursions, and the shifting power balances of the Islamic world. At the heart of their strategy lay the architecture of Fira, model of influence grounded not in mass violence, but in selective, symbolic, and psychologically disruptive acts. The Ismaili state centered around fortified mountain strongholds, the most notable being Alamet in Persia and Masyaf in Syria. These locations were not randomly chosen. They provided both physical security and psychological dominance. From these elevated positions, the Ismailis maintained visual control over surrounding territories and secured critical trade and communication routes. Yet their real power did not stem from geography alone. It emerged from their ability to influence actors far beyond their territorial base. This influence was achieved through a unique synthesis of ideology, pedagogy, and operational secrecy. Ismaili doctrine emphasized a hierarchical cosmology and the necessity of concealed knowledge, taqiyya. Within this framework, the imam was not merely a political figure, but a divinely guided interpreter of esoteric truth. This theological dimension allowed the Ismailis to build intense internal cohesion and discipline. Members of the order were initiated through structured stages of indoctrination, each layer revealing progressively deeper layers of doctrine and operational trust. This compartmentalization mirrored modern intelligence organizations where access to information and responsibilities were strictly tiered. Operatives, often referred to in the West as fedayeen, functioned as both ideological instruments and tactical agents. The mythos surrounding these operatives is often overshadowed their strategic function. Western accounts, particularly from Crusaders and hostile Sunni chroniclers, depicted the assassins as mindless killers drugged into obedience. These narratives served to delegitimize the Ismailis while simultaneously amplifying their aura of menace. In reality, evidence suggests that their actions were highly selective and targeted. Victims were typically political or religious leaders whose actions directly threatened the Ismaili community. Assassinations were often carried out in public, sometimes even within sacred precincts, ensuring maximum visibility and symbolic disruption. These acts were not simply eliminations. They were psychological operations designed to destabilize hierarchies and demonstrate reach. The architecture of fear engineered by the Ismailis did not rely on frequency, but on unpredictability and spectacle. The mere possibility that a ruler could be targeted created a deterrent effect that extended beyond their actual operational capacity. In this sense, their influence functioned through an economy of perception. To maintain this system, the Ismailis invested in intelligence gathering, surveillance, and internal communication networks. While much of the operational detail has been lost, especially following the Mongol destruction of Alamet, indirect evidence from diplomatic correspondence, Sunni polemics, and Crusader chronicles suggests a systematized mode of information collection and strategic dissemination. One key characteristic of the Ismaili method was its emphasis on minimal collateral damage. Unlike later conceptions of terror, the Nizaris did not engage in indiscriminate killing. Their operations were designed to achieve precision objectives, eliminate a dangerous vizier, neutralize an inquisitorial cleric, destabilize an advancing army's morale. These objectives required careful planning, long-term infiltration, and local intelligence. This sophistication contradicts the portrayal of the assassins as irrational fanatics and places them instead within a rational model of political survival. Through asymmetrical tactics, the symbolic weight of their actions extended into the realm of historiography. While Ismaili records were largely destroyed or absorbed into broader Shia intellectual traditions, their impact was preserved in the writings of their enemies. Ironically, this hostile documentation helped to preserve their historical memory, though in distorted form. The absence of internal Ismaili archival material from the medieval period severely limits our ability to reconstruct their activities in detail. However, this very absence, combined with the persistent presence of fear and condemnation in other sources, to their effectiveness. Their legacy is inscribed less in what they wrote than in what others wrote about them. The Ismailis approach to secrecy extended to their organizational design. Authority was decentralized across various fortresses, each headed by a dey missionary leader who answered to a central hierarchy. The transmission of orders, doctrine, and information was deliberately opaque to external observers. Outsiders, and even low-level insiders, could seldom reconstruct the full picture of the network. This organizational opacity created a form of epistemological deterrence. Rulers and chroniclers could never be entirely certain of the group's capacity, intent, or reach. In this ambiguity lay their power. Their interactions with Crusader states further illustrate their pragmatic flexibility. While initially adversarial, the Ismailis at times entered into temporary alliances or non-aggression arrangements with Crusader lords, especially when facing common threats from Sunni powers. These transactions were pragmatic rather than ideological, revealing an adaptive intelligence posture rather than blind theological rigidity. The assassins did not hesitate to engage in diplomacy, intelligence sharing, and even ransom arrangements when it served their strategic interest. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century marked a turning point. The destruction of Alamet by Hulagu Canon 1256 resulted in the loss of their libraries, administrative records, and training manuals. Much of what constituted the operational backbone of the Ismaili state was systematically erased. What remained was a combination of oral tradition, diasporic memory, and enemy accounts. This archival erasure complicates any attempt to understand the full extent of their influence. It also illustrates the vulnerability of intelligence-based systems to physical annihilation, a recurring theme in the history of suppressed archives. Yet the psychological architecture they constructed persisted. The notion that knowledge could be weaponized, that ideological commitment could replace material resources, and that precision violence could alter macro-political dynamics, these concepts had enduring impact. They represented a form of power, independent of empire, army, or bureaucracy. Their legacy challenges the assumption that medieval history was shaped solely by visible institutions. It opens the possibility that much of what unfolded alliances, betrayals, dynastic changes, theological shifts was influenced by actors operating in the shadows, leveraging fear, secrecy, and epistemic asymmetry. The Ismaili assassins exemplify how a minority group, through discipline, ideology, and strategic communication, could influence the political and historical trajectory of their time. Their existence demands a re-examination of how history is framed, whose actions are documented, and how fear itself becomes a medium of influence. As we proceed through further layers of archival manipulation and intelligence deployment, the case of the assassins remains a foundational example of how secrecy constructs not only perception, but historical reality. The consolidation of the Latin Church's authority during the medieval period was neither spontaneous nor purely theological. It was achieved through a prolonged process of structural centralization, ritual standardization, and systematic suppression of dissent. Central to this campaign was the codification of orthodoxy, the deliberate construction of a unified doctrinal framework, and the parallel elimination or marginalization of competing interpretations. The Church did not merely defend orthodoxy, it defined it, documented it, and engineered its institutional enforcement across Europe. This act of definition was not limited to theological abstraction. It extended into the realm of history, producing a sanctioned record that excluded or distorted all that did not align with ecclesiastical objectives. The mechanisms for this control became increasingly formalized after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century. These reforms, spearheaded by Pope Gregory VII and his successors, aimed to extricate the Church from secular interference and reassert papal supremacy. Among their many dimensions, celibacy of the clergy, the fight against simony, and ecclesiastical independence, the centralizing of doctrinal authority stands out as an inflection point for historical manipulation. Councils and synods were called to standardize belief, canonize scripture, and declare deviations as heresies. In doing so, they not only constructed theological boundaries, but also redrew the historical record to favor those boundaries. The councils functioned as both legislative and archival events. Their decrees, collected in canon law compilations such as Gratian's Decretum, were meticulously documented, copied, and disseminated. These compilations served as reference texts for clerics, bishops, and inquisitors, effectively creating an official epistemological apparatus. What they omitted was just as consequential as what they included. The exclusion of apocryphal gospels, early Christian heterodox writings, or regional traditions from these compilations erased alternative perspectives from the official memory of the Church. This editorial curation was not presented as ideological, it was framed as the preservation of truth against error. The result, however, was a homogenized record, stripped of nuance, plurality, and dissent. At the same time, the Latin Church embarked on a campaign of intellectual control through the scholastic movement. Anchored in cathedral schools and later in universities such as Paris and Bologna, Scholasticism established a rigid method of inquiry based on authoritative texts, especially the Bible, the Church Fathers, and Aristotelian logic as interpreted by Christian commentators. This method produced highly structured arguments, but restricted the scope of permissible debate. Theologians who strayed beyond defined boundaries risked censure or worse. The cases of Peter Abelard, whose work was condemned for dialectically questioning dogma, and later Meister Eckhart, accused of heresy for mystical theology, exemplify how intellectual creativity was constrained within a narrowly defined orthodoxy. Inquisitions represented the enforcement arm of this doctrinal regime. Initially informal investigations, these evolved into systematic tribunals empowered to interrogate, judge, and punish those deemed heretical. Their procedures, while superficially legalistic, operated under the assumption of guilt. Documentation from inquisitorial trials reveals a pattern of coerced confessions, anonymous accusations, and deliberate suppression of defense. Records of these proceedings were meticulously kept, not as an exercise in fairness, but as evidence of the Church's righteous prosecution of error. Once recorded, these confessions became historical facts, framing entire communities such as the Cathars or the Waldensians as inherently deviant, regardless of their actual beliefs or practices. Crucially, the inquisitorial process generated its own archive. Manuals like Bernard Guy's Practica Inquisitionis detailed procedures for interrogation, surveillance, and evidence collection. These texts did not simply reflect practice, they shaped it. They formalized methods by which information was collected, distorted, and codified into the permanent record. The result was a double archive, one of theological orthodoxy and another of institutional enforcement. Together, they created a comprehensive apparatus for defining truth and eliminating alternatives. The Latin Church's use of excommunication further reinforced this system. Excommunication functioned not merely as a spiritual sanction, but as a social and historical erasure. Individuals and groups cut off from the Church lost not only sacramental privileges, but legal protections, reputational standing, and narrative inclusion. Their deeds, arguments, and contributions were often expunged or recast as subversive. In many cases, the only surviving records of such figures are polemics written against them. Their own writings were destroyed, their followers dispersed, and their memory reconstituted through the lens of condemnation. The Vatican's role in preserving and editing ecclesiastical history must also be examined. While often credited with the conservation of classical and theological manuscripts, the Vatican Archives, an expansive and highly restricted repository, reflect centuries of curation, redaction, and restricted access. Papal correspondence, records of councils, financial transactions, and internal doctrinal disputes are stored within, but much remains inaccessible or selectively revealed. The protocols for archival access have historically favored those aligned with ecclesiastical interests. This control over documentation and historiography allows the Church not only to protect its institutional memory, but to shape how it is interpreted by future generations. The veneration of saints presents another dimension of narrative control. Hagiographies, or saintly biographies, served as both spiritual inspiration and historical record. However, they were often composed with a loose relationship to empirical fact, prioritizing miracle accounts, divine favor, and moral exemplarity. These texts functioned less as biographies and more as instruments of canonization, elevating certain figures while ignoring or absorbing their rivals. In many cases, regional cults of local saints were suppressed or absorbed into broader Catholic tradition only after significant modification. This process consolidated ecclesiastical authority by unifying disparate spiritual practices under an approved pantheon. All of these efforts were framed within a cosmology that saw history as a divine narrative. The Church positioned itself not only as an interpreter of that narrative, but as its authorized author. Events were documented not in terms of cause and effect, but in terms of divine will and moral consequence. This orientation allowed the Church to recast political failures as tests of faith, defeats as martyrdoms, and victories as signs of divine favor. It also enabled the transformation of real political or doctrinal conflicts into allegorical battles between good and evil, with little room for nuance or reinterpretation. In aggregate, the Latin Church's codification of orthodoxy was a totalizing project. It sought to create a singular framework for understanding the world spiritually, morally, and historically. To that end, it manipulated archives, censored dissent, and restructured intellectual life around an authoritative center. What emerged was not merely a body of doctrine, but a machinery of memory, a system capable of producing, enforcing, and perpetuating its own version of reality. This machinery continues to influence historical understanding to this day. Modern historians often rely on sources produced within or preserved by the Church. Yet if those sources were created under a regime of epistemic control, then their reliability must be critically examined. The silence of lost alternatives, the distortions of surviving polemics, and the curated nature of ecclesiastical records all point to a fundamental question. To what extent has the history of Europe been shaped not by what happened, but by what the Church allowed to be remembered? The idea of intelligence as an organized discipline often evokes modern institutions, state surveillance agencies, digital interception, coded diplomatic cables. Yet the foundational structures of intelligence long predate the modern era. In the medieval world, the collection, transmission, and manipulation of sensitive information formed a vital substratum of political and ecclesiastical power. While these practices were not centralized under single bureaucracies, they were highly functional, embedded within broader socio-religious networks, and used with purpose. Intelligence in the medieval period was not ancillary. It was strategic, often determining the outcomes of conflicts, alliances, and doctrinal decisions. Contrary to the image of the medieval world as isolated and static, it was deeply interconnected. Trade routes, pilgrimages, ecclesiastical visits, and military campaigns formed extensive communication networks across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. These pathways did not merely facilitate goods and spiritual exchange, they also carried news, rumors, coded messages, and strategic observations. Monarchs, popes, caliphs, and merchants all relied on these conduits to gain advanced knowledge of rivals' intentions and to shape regional developments through selective information deployment. One of the most consistent intelligence channels in this period was the ecclesiastical network. The Church operated as a supranational institution, with representatives stationed across dioceses and abbeys throughout Christendom. Papal legates, bishops, and monastic envoys gathered and relayed information back to Rome, often bypassing secular authorities. The confessional system further augmented this intelligence matrix. Though framed as a spiritual exercise, confession placed clerics in a position to acquire sensitive insights about familial, political, and economic dynamics at the local level. While there is limited direct evidence of confessions being systematically weaponized for intelligence purposes, the potential for informational asymmetry was inherent in the structure itself. Pilgrimage offered another mechanism for gathering intelligence under the guise of piety. Pilgrims traveled long distances, often crossing through volatile or contested territories. Their observations conveyed in letters, oral reports, or transmitted through monastic hospitality, could provide valuable intelligence about border conditions, troop movements, regional stability, or heretical activity. Monasteries and religious houses that hosted pilgrims also served as informal listening posts, where rumors and first-hand accounts were collected, sifted, and sometimes forwarded up the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In parallel, secular rulers developed their own intelligence practices. Royal courts employed messengers, diplomats, and covert agents tasked with acquiring strategic knowledge about rival kingdoms, rebellious nobles, or foreign alliances. These agents often operated under diplomatic cover, but their reports served critical functions in shaping military strategy and treaty negotiation. Code and cipher usage, while not yet sophisticated by modern standards, did exist. Substitution ciphers, invisible ink, and cryptic notations in margin glosses or private letters reflect an understanding that sensitive information required protection during transit. Merchants constituted another key vector of intelligence. Commercial hubs of Venice, Genoa, Constantinople, and later Bruges and Lubeck were not only financial centers, but intelligence-rich environments. Merchant guilds maintained correspondence networks across regions and developed protocols to evaluate political risk, local instability, and trade route security. In many cases, merchants acted as informal advisors to political authorities, leveraging their access to foreign ports and courts to provide insights that governments could not procure directly. The overlapping interests of commerce and politics meant that financial intelligence debts, grain prices, coin debasement, naval blockades had immediate geopolitical implications. Military orders, as explored in prior sections, added a further layer. Their mobility, multi-jurisdictional reach, and institutional independence positioned them as natural conduits for intelligence. Templars, for example, maintained detailed records of transactions, landholdings, and regional threats. Their presence in both Latin Christendom and the Crusader states provided them with a unique synoptic view of Christian-Muslim interactions. While the degree to which they engaged in formal espionage remains debated, their capacity to collect, store, and act upon critical information is not in doubt. Language played a significant role in these dynamics. Multilingualism common among diplomats, merchants, and clerics enabled cross-cultural observation and analysis. Arabic-speaking monks, Greek-speaking merchants, and Latin-fluent scholars served as cultural intermediaries. They translated texts, interpreted diplomatic gestures, and served as human filters of intelligence. This translation process was not neutral. What was emphasized or omitted in translation could serve to amplify threat perception, distort strategic understanding, or redirect policy. Thus, the manipulation of language itself became a subtle but potent instrument of pre-modern intelligence. Information was not merely collected, it was also shaped. Chroniclers embedded within courts and abbeys were often tasked with framing events in ways that aligned with political objectives. Reports of battles, coronations, miracles, or portents were adjusted to suit agendas. In this way, narrative became a tool of influence. A defeat could be reinterpreted as a test of faith, a rebellion framed as divine punishment for royal negligence, an alliance portrayed as the fulfillment of prophecy. These manipulations, though lacking the immediacy of modern propaganda, nonetheless influenced perception and behavior across regions and generations. Interrogations, too, were a method of intelligence extraction. Captured prisoners, suspected heretics, or political opponents were often subjected to questioning, not merely for punitive purposes, but to extract actionable information. The development of the inquisitorial protocol, later formalized in the 13th century, reflects an increasingly systematic approach to extracting and documenting intelligence under the guise of spiritual correction. The reliability of such information varied widely. Gossip, fabrication, and strategic misinformation were common. Agents often had incentives to exaggerate threats or conceal failures. Yet this did not diminish the importance placed on such intelligence by decision-makers. Even flawed or biased information could serve to justify preemptive action, consolidate internal control, or reshape public sentiment. In this way, medieval intelligence functioned not merely as a reflection of reality, but as a creator of perceived necessity. What emerges from this web of interactions is a model of intelligence that was decentralized yet effective, analog yet strategic. Its techniques were tailored to the limitations and opportunities of the medieval world: restricted literacy, long travel times, and deep entanglement between religion and power. Rather than seeing this system as primitive, it is more accurate to recognize it as adaptive. The objectives were the same as those of modern intelligence: anticipate threats, exploit opportunities, influence outcomes, but the means were embedded in social, religious, and economic infrastructures. This layered architecture of information transmission also suggests a key insight: if intelligence shaped decision-making, and if those decisions were documented in chronicles, letters, and ecclesiastical rulings, then the historical record itself cannot be disentangled from the intelligence that informed it. Consequently, understanding the mechanisms of pre-modern intelligence is not ancillary to historical inquiry, it is foundational. The next logical step is to examine how the very places where history was written, such as the scriptorium, served as both passive recipients and active participants in this informational ecosystem. The scriptorium, traditionally viewed as a place of quiet scholarship and monastic devotion, functioned in practice as a strategic instrument of narrative control. Though framed as spaces for the preservation and copying of sacred texts, scriptoria were embedded in a wider architecture of institutional influence. They were not neutral transcription centers. They were ideological engines where history was filtered, edited, and manufactured. In the context of medieval power dynamics, the scriptorium was weaponized, its silence masking editorial interventions, its labor cloaked in piety while actively shaping the future contours of collective memory. A scriptorium was typically a room or complex within a monastery where trained scribes produced manuscripts under the supervision of senior clerics or abbots. These manuscripts ranged from biblical texts and theological commentaries to hagiographies, chronicles, and legal codes. Every stage of production, from parchment preparation and layout to rubrication and illustration, was governed by strict protocols. While the technical precision of these operations has been widely documented, less attention has been paid to their ideological implications. The selection of text for reproduction, the choice of scriptural interpretations to emphasize, and the subtle revisions embedded in successive copies constituted an infrastructure of control disguised as fidelity. Unlike printing, which introduced the possibility of mass replication and standardization, manuscript culture was inherently mutable. Each reproduction allowed for interpolation, correction, and erasure. These alterations were often subtle: a phrase omitted here, a date adjusted there, a name replaced, or an entire passage harmonized with current orthodoxy. Such changes were rarely acknowledged. The scribe, presumed to be a passive transmitter, was in fact an editor, a censor, and occasionally a forger. The authority of the manuscript resided in its appearance, its Latin fluency, its alignment with known sources, its visual presentation, not in its fidelity to an original that, in many cases, no longer existed or had never existed in a fixed form. This problem was exacerbated by the scarcity of manuscripts. With each book requiring hundreds of hours to produce, very few copies of any given text existed. This scarcity gave each surviving copy disproportionate influence. Once a revised manuscript was accepted into a monastic or episcopal library, it often became the authoritative version. Future copies would replicate its interpolations. In this way, the scriptorium did not simply preserve knowledge. It defined it. Over generations, such editorial interventions solidified into canon, erasing evidence of revision and obfuscating the boundary between source and commentary. Chronicles present one of the clearest examples of this process. Medieval chronicles were supposed to record events in sequential order, linking local developments with divine providence and royal legitimacy. However, chroniclers often relied on earlier texts that had already been altered, selectively omitted contradictory data, or inserted retrospective interpretations to legitimize current authorities. A victory could be framed as the fulfillment of prophecy. A disputed succession glossed over as peaceful transition. An inconvenient rebellion omitted altogether. The scribes who copied these chronicles reinforced these interpretations by reproducing them without comment, and occasionally by enhancing their moral framing with marginal annotations. Even more troubling is the handling of sources deemed heterodox. Apocryphal gospels, rival philosophical treatises, or records of theological dissent were often copied only to be condemned, annotated with warnings, or edited into alignment with prevailing orthodoxy. In some cases, texts were preserved solely for polemical purposes, stripped of context, and used as evidence of heresy. The absence of rebuttals or original versions created an epistemic imbalance, whereby the only available testimony about dissenting views came from those who opposed them. The scriptorium, therefore, became a site not only of memory but of controlled forgetting. Illustration and marginalia added another layer of influence. Images embedded in manuscripts were not decorative alone, they carried interpretative weight. Depictions of events or figures conveyed theological meaning and reinforced moral hierarchies. Marginal notes, often written centuries after the original text, were incorporated into the manuscript tradition, creating an anachronistic feedback loop in which contemporary orthodoxy was projected backward. These additions, treated by later scribes as part of the original, were replicated without qualification, further entrenching distortion. The institutional context of the scriptorium also influenced its function. Many scriptoria operated under the patronage of abbots with strong political affiliations, bishops with doctrinal agendas, or monarchs seeking legitimation. Commissioned manuscripts often bore dedications, prefaces, or closing remarks tailored to the interests of patrons. These dedicatory texts were not ancillary, they framed the work, shaped its reception, and guided interpretation. In royal courts, the production of legal codes and genealogies through affiliated scriptoria contributed directly to claims of dynastic legitimacy. In the ecclesiastical context, the production of conciliar records and papal bulls reinforced centralized control over distant dioceses and religious communities. Forgery was not uncommon. The production of false charters, fabricated land grants, or invented privileges has been documented across Europe. These forgeries were often meticulously constructed, using paleographic techniques, linguistic mimicry, and historically plausible details. Many remained undetected for centuries and were only identified through modern critical methods. Their survival in monastic archives and their repeated citation by subsequent authorities demonstrate how the scriptorium could actively generate the documents upon which legitimacy depended. The line between authentic and forged became blurred, not only because of deceit, but because of institutional incentive structures that rewarded plausible alignment over factual precision. The internal training of scribes reinforced these dynamics. Novices were taught not only how to copy, but what to copy and how to recognize textual errors, a category that included theological deviance as well as grammatical mistakes. Scribes were instructed to conform divergent readings to accepted doctrine, to standardize spelling, and to remove ambiguities. These practices, justified under the rubric of clarity and orthodoxy, had the effect of narrowing the semantic and doctrinal range of surviving texts. Over time, the cumulative impact of such interventions reshaped the archive, producing a textual landscape that appeared consistent, unbroken, and authoritative precisely because it had been engineered to seem so. It would be inaccurate to claim that every scribe operated with malicious intent. Many believed they were preserving truth, correcting errors, or honoring tradition. The problem lies not in individual motives but in systemic structures. The scriptorium was embedded in an environment where conformity was valorized, dissent stigmatized, and patronage demanded alignment. Under such conditions, editorial intervention became normative. The result is an archive that reflects not only what was known, but what institutions needed to be known. Modern historiography often takes medieval manuscripts as its foundational sources. Yet if these sources were mediated through processes of selection, revision, and suppression, then their evidentiary value must be critically reassessed. The scriptorium, far from being a passive transmitter of tradition, was an active participant in the construction of historical reality. It served as a filter, a forge, and occasionally a fabrication engine. Its role in shaping what we consider to be the historical record is not peripheral, it is central. Any investigation into the manipulation of medieval history must reckon with this silent architecture of textual control. The medieval world, despite its feudal fragmentation and theological rigidity, was marked by persistent intercultural contact, often unacknowledged in mainstream historical narratives. These interactions occurred not only through warfare and pilgrimage, but also through clandestine channels of espionage, diplomacy, and covert communication. Cross-cultural espionage, the collection and manipulation of strategic information across religious and political divides, played a significant role in shaping the contours of power, belief, and knowledge throughout the period. This transmission of secrets not only influenced battlefield outcomes and treaty negotiations, but also recalibrated historiographical narratives to reflect the priorities of dominant regimes. The Crusades, often depicted as straightforward conflicts between Christianity and Islam, were in reality entangled with information exchange. While military engagements and theological polemics defined the public sphere, a quieter undercurrent of intelligence gathering, defection, and negotiated accommodation persisted behind the scenes. Both Muslim and Christian leaders employed informants, translators, and defectors to acquire data on enemy fortifications, troop movements, supply chains, and diplomatic intentions. These efforts were not haphazard. They followed identifiable patterns, often facilitated through shared commercial interests or ethnic intermediaries such as Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. The Levanten coast became a dense zone of such exchanges. In ports like Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch, merchants operated alongside military personnel, clergy, and itinerant scholars. These urban environments created ideal conditions for covert observation and message transfer. Spies could pose as merchants, translators, or even monks. On pilgrimage, Muslim courts were well aware of these tactics and maintained counterintelligence measures of their own. Saladin, for instance, employed a sophisticated diplomatic corps that monitored Frankish activity, often intercepting correspondence and manipulating misinformation to sow confusion among Crusader forces. Byzantium, strategically situated between Latin Christendom and the Islamic world, functioned as a conduit and buffer for espionage activities. Its diplomatic traditions emphasized subtlety, misdirection, and the use of espionage as a tool of statecraft. Byzantine officials maintained extensive intelligence dossiers on Latin and Muslim rulers alike. The imperial court used embassies, not only for negotiation but for intelligence collection tracking succession disputes, military preparations, and theological debates that could be leveraged for advantage. Byzantine agents regularly intercepted Western correspondence, modified messages, or spread selective misinformation to manipulate Crusader behavior, particularly during the First and Second Crusades. Trade networks similarly served as vessels for intelligence. The Silk Road, extending from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean, carried not only goods but also rumors, technological knowledge, and political news. Muslim and Nestorian Christian merchants, operating under the Abbasid Caliphate or Mongol patronage, acted as informal conduits of information. European states, particularly Venice and Genoa, recognized the intelligence value of these networks and embedded agents within their commercial operations. Maritime republics were especially adept at balancing open trade with covert surveillance. Venetian reports, for example, include detailed assessments of Egyptian naval strength, Turkish cavalry tactics, and Persian internal unrest. Language acquisition played a crucial role in cross-cultural espionage. Translators, often drawn from multilingual minority communities such as Jews, Armenians, and Syrians, facilitated more than mere communication. They transmitted nuance, intentions, and interpretative frameworks. These intermediaries were indispensable, not only in diplomatic exchanges but in parsing intercepted documents, eavesdropping on foreign courts, and repurposing theological or legal texts for polemical aims. Their work was essential to both the extraction and the encoding of sensitive information. Religious orders, especially those with trans-regional presence, also participated in information gathering across cultural boundaries. Dominican and Franciscan missionaries, ostensibly focused on conversion, compiled ethnographic reports on the Mongols, Muslims, and Eastern Christians. These texts, often sent back to Rome, included military assessments, descriptions of customs, and analyses of belief systems. While framed as missionary observations, they served a dual function, expanding theological understanding while informing strategic calculations. The information obtained was filtered, stylized, and weaponized, sometimes in the service of justifying further crusades, sometimes to bolster ecclesiastical authority by demonstrating mastery over foreign lands and beliefs. On the Islamic side, diplomatic missions dispatched to European courts were similarly well versed in the collection of strategic information. Ambassadors from the Almohads, Fatimids, and Mamluks often traveled with entourages that included legal scholars, astronomers, and traders, figures capable of recording infrastructure, cultural practices, and military readiness under the guise of curiosity or scholarship. These agents played long games, compiling slow intelligence that might only be used years later, during periods of renewed conflict or negotiation. One notable avenue of secret transmission was through books themselves. Manuscripts acquired during raids or diplomatic gifts occasionally contained marginalia, codicological alterations, or even embedded symbols meant to convey additional meanings. Some accounts suggest that books were used to transport hidden messages via palimpsests or underlinings intelligible only to specific readers. Libraries thus became contested spaces, not only repositories of knowledge but objects of strategic value. The seizure of libraries after sieges, particularly in Islamic Spain or during the sack of Constantinople in 1204, was motivated as much by the hunger for knowledge as by a desire to dominate the historical narrative. These cross-cultural exchanges also shaped how each side represented the other. In both Christian and Muslim polemics, depictions of the other were not solely ideological. They often drew from real intelligence, selectively distorted to serve propaganda purposes. Crusader chronicles referenced Islamic practices with a mix of horror and admiration, frequently echoing details that could only have been obtained through close contact. Islamic treatises on Christian doctrine, particularly those composed in Al-Andalus, displayed an awareness of Latin theological subtleties that suggests sustained espionage-informed engagement. Importantly, this intelligence traffic was not unidirectional. There were cases of mutual influence, triangulation, and deliberate disinformation. For instance, both the Crusader states and the Islamic dynasties engaged in psychological warfare by exaggerating their strength in intercepted communications or deploying decoys to confuse enemy observers. Letters intercepted in translation were sometimes altered to mislead. Diplomatic hosts would intentionally allow visiting envoys to overhear court discussions or view certain military preparations to misdirect conclusions. What these examples reveal is a world where information did not respect borders or creeds. The assumption that medieval Europe was hermetically sealed against foreign influence is untenable in light of these dynamics. Instead, power was exercised in part through the collection, suppression, and deployment of cross-cultural intelligence. This process did not merely affect tactical decisions. It shaped how entire civilizations perceived each other, and how they recorded those perceptions in their historical and religious texts. The consequences of this espionage web are twofold. First, many of the surviving documents that historians rely upon today were produced in environments shaped by misinformation, strategic exaggeration, and reactive policy. Second, the narrative distance between cultures often portrayed as the result of irreconcilable theological difference was itself the product of calculated narrative engineering, supported by intelligence operations on both sides. Considering how historical canons were formed, the transmission and distortion of secrets across cultural lines must be treated not as peripheral phenomena, but as integral components. Medieval archive is not an isolated product of internal development. It is a palimpsest of competition, surveillance, and translation, shaped by forces as opaque as they were influential. The rewriting of history, therefore, cannot be disentangled from the networks that carried not only knowledge but the deliberate manipulation of its meaning. The diplomatic machinery of the papacy in the medieval period extended far beyond its spiritual mandate. While often depicted as a religious institution preoccupied with theology and liturgy, the papacy was in practice a geopolitical actor with expansive administrative infrastructure, global reach, and carefully maintained secrecy. Papal diplomacy was not merely a set of negotiations or ceremonial exchanges. It was an ongoing campaign of influence projection, narrative management, and archival manipulation. Central to its effectiveness was the construction of infallibility, a concept not formally codified until the First Vatican Council of 1870, but long cultivated through institutional practice and historiographical control. By the 11th century, particularly after the Gregorian reform movement, the papacy had embarked on a process of juridical and political centralization. This campaign was justified through an ideology of divine appointment, with the Pope positioned as the vicar of Christ on earth. As this claim intensified, so too did the strategic need to present papal decisions, both past and present, as immune from error. The consequence was the development of a diplomatic culture in which history was actively revised or suppressed to prevent any rupture in perceived continuity or coherence. The image of the Pope as a neutral arbiter and ultimate authority was carefully engineered through selective documentation and narrative framing. Papal legates served as the principal instruments of this diplomacy. These emissaries, often drawn from the curial elite, were dispatched across Europe and into the Near East to conduct negotiations, mediate disputes, and gather intelligence. Their correspondence, preserved in the papal registers, constituted a vast repository of political maneuvering, often cloaked in spiritual language. These letters were not always candid records of events. They were documents of intention, constructed to defend papal prerogatives, establish legal precedent, and manage the image of the Holy See. In cases where events deviated from expectations, the record was often reframed to minimize contradiction or erase failure. This archival malleability was enabled by the structure of the papal chancery. As the bureaucratic engine of the Romane Curia, the chancery was responsible for drafting, copying, and preserving all papal correspondence and decrees. The chancery employed a rotating staff of notaries and secretaries, trained not only in Latin composition but in legal formulation and political discretion. The internal logic of the chancery rewarded consistency with papal positions and penalized deviations. Discrepant letters were reworded, problematic claims were expunged, and ambiguous outcomes were recast as resolved. Over time, the chancery produced a corpus of documentation that presented papal diplomacy as seamless, coherent, and universally respected, even when historical evidence suggests otherwise. A key example is the handling of the investiture controversy. While modern historians recognize this as a bitter power struggle between the papacy and secular rulers over the appointment of bishops, The papal records downplay the political conflict and emphasize the moral clarity of the reformist agenda. Letters to and from Emperor Henry IV, for instance, were selectively preserved, with versions redacted or altered to reflect papal victory and doctrinal consistency. The famous excommunication and subsequent penance at Canossa in 1077 was framed in papal chronicles as a triumph of ecclesiastical authority. Yet outside sources suggest a more complex power dynamic, including negotiations, coercion, and shifting alliances, factors minimized or erased in papal narrative reconstructions. The Crusades offer further evidence of narrative construction. The Pope's role in initiating the First Crusade was not simply rhetorical, it was archival. The call to arms at the Council of Clermont in 1095 was recorded and disseminated in multiple versions, each tailored to different audiences. Some emphasized spiritual reward, others focused on political liberation or the defense of the Eastern Church. The Vatican preserved the versions most aligned with its evolving priorities, allowing historians to see how papal motivations were calibrated and recast over time. The institutional memory of the Crusades was managed not by an impartial scribe, but by a bureaucracy invested in maintaining moral and strategic authority. Papal diplomacy also engaged in the strategic use of forged documents. The most infamous example remains the donation of Constantine, a fabricated imperial decree purportedly granting the Pope temporal authority over the Western Roman Empire. Though modern scholarship has decisively proven the document to be an 8th century forgery, it was treated as authentic by the papal chancery for centuries, cited in legal disputes and used to justify territorial claims. The persistence of this document in official usage, even after doubts about its authenticity had circulated, illustrates how the Vatican prioritized the appearance of continuity and legitimacy over factual accuracy. Another technique was the redefinition of terminology to resolve contradictions. Heretical groups, once described in more neutral terms, were gradually recast in uniformly negative language, their historical interactions with the Church either ignored or reframed as confrontational. For example, the early contacts between the papacy and the Waldensians involved efforts at doctrinal reconciliation. Yet later documents retroactively reclassified them as subversive heretics from the outset, creating a streamlined history of conflict that erased periods of dialogue or ambiguity. This rhetorical homogenization was essential for maintaining a linear narrative of papal vigilance and doctrinal purity. Diplomatic failures were often hidden through the absorption of inconvenient outcomes into broader theological narratives. When missions to the Mongol Empire failed to convert the Khans or establish political alliances, papal records did not always acknowledge these failures directly. Instead, they emphasized the universality of the Christian message, the bravery of the envoys, or the mystery of God's providential timing. In this way, diplomatic setbacks were reframed as moral victories, ensuring that the institutional reputation of the papacy remained unblemished. The infallibility of the Pope, though not yet dogmatically defined in the medieval period, was maintained through these documentary practices. The consistency of papal pronouncements across time was engineered through editorial intervention, selection bias, and historical silencing. The Vatican's ability to present itself as the unbroken voice of Christian truth depended not only on theological argument, but on the archival control that ensured contradictions, doubts, and reversals remained hidden from public scrutiny. Even when papal authority was challenged by emperors, antipopes, or reform movements, the Vatican's response was archivally strategic. Dissenting views were either not recorded, buried in marginal notations, or preserved only in polemical refutations. The voices of critics, if they survived at all, were filtered through the Church's own language, ensuring that they were heard only as examples of error or deviation. This epistemic insulation was as much a product of record-keeping as it was of ideology. the long-term effect of these practices is still visible in modern historical interpretation. The Vatican archives, among the most extensive in the world, remain highly controlled in terms of access and disclosure. Selective publication of documents, restricted access to sensitive collections, and the slow pace of archival transparency continue to shape how scholars engage with the past. While many scholars within the Church work with great rigor and honesty, the structure of the archive itself still bears the imprint of centuries of narrative curation. Papal diplomacy was thus never limited to external negotiation. It was an internal campaign to manufacture coherence, manage memory, and suppress discontinuity. The cloak of infallibility was not simply a claim of divine guidance, it was a product of institutional documentation strategy. The Vatican did not merely participate in history, it produced history with a level of precision, selectivity, and ideological investment unmatched by any secular institution of its time. The official record of medieval heresy presents a paradox. It claims to describe religious deviants who threatened the moral fabric of Christendom. Yet the vast majority of these descriptions come from the very institutions that persecuted them. With few exceptions, the voices of heretics, whether Cathars, Bogomils Waldensians, or other groups, do not survive in their own words. Their theological positions, practices, and social structures are known almost exclusively through trial records, inquisitorial manuals, denunciations, and polemical treatises. In this way, the historical construction of heresy has largely been written by its enemies. What survives is not a record of what heretical groups believed, but a curated dossier of accusations, confessions extracted under duress, and theological misrepresentations designed to justify repression. This manufactured knowledge served political and ecclesiastical aims, and in doing so, reshaped the historical landscape to reflect the priorities of institutional orthodoxy. The Cathars, perhaps the most well-known of medieval heretical groups, illustrate this dynamic in striking terms. Emerging in the Languedoc region of southern France in the 12th century, the Cathars are commonly described as dualists who rejected the physical world and the authority of the Catholic Church. However, most of what is known about them derives from the records of inquisitors such as Bernard Gouy and Jacques Fournier, who interrogated suspected Cathars during and after the Albigensian Crusade. These records, while detailed, were created under coercive circumstances. Accused individuals were often imprisoned, threatened, or tortured until they confessed to theological errors that mirrored the expectations of their interrogators. The resulting testimonies frequently reflect a combination of theological projection, misunderstood beliefs, and strategic compliance aimed at survival, even where heretical texts did exist, such as the secret Book of the Cathars or Bogomil writings. Most were destroyed or only preserved within condemnatory Catholic compilations. In some cases, quotes were embedded within refutations, surrounded by commentary designed to discredit the original. The surviving fragments are thus filtered, incomplete, and often decontextualized. Modern historians attempting to reconstruct the doctrines of these groups must work within an archive that was deliberately cleansed of their authentic voices. This epistemic violence was not incidental. It was structural, executed through coordinated ecclesiastical procedures designed to eliminate not just the heretics, but the possibility of their narrative surviving. The Bogomils of the Balkans, precursors to the Cathars in several doctrinal respects, were likewise targeted by Byzantine and Latin Church authorities. Their teachings, which combined elements of dualism, anti-clericalism, and apocalyptic expectation, were seen as a threat not only to theological orthodoxy, but to social and political hierarchies. Byzantine polemicists such as Euthymios Zigabinos documented Bogomil beliefs with a blend of theological hostility and ethnographic curiosity. Yet even these texts aimed less at understanding than at containment. The very act of describing Bogomils served to define the outer limits of acceptable belief. Their suppression through councils, edicts, and military campaigns was legitimized by the documentation that cast them as irredeemably corrupt or satanic. The Waldensians offer a different but equally illustrative case. Founded by Peter Waldo in the late 12th century, the Waldensians initially sought to promote apostolic poverty and lay preaching within the church. Their early interactions with the ecclesiastical hierarchy involved attempts at dialogue and reform, not outright schism. However, their persistence in unauthorized preaching, coupled with their criticism of clerical wealth, led to their condemnation. Subsequent records classify them as heretics, aligning them with groups they had little to do with doctrinally. This homogenization of heresy, grouping diverse movements under a single category of deviance, served to simplify ecclesiastical policy and reinforce the binary of orthodoxy versus error. Inquisitorial manuals played a pivotal role in the rewriting of heresy. Texts such as Bernard Guy's Practica Inquisitionis and Nicholas Emeric's Directorium Inquisitorum provided standardized methods for identifying, interrogating, and condemning suspected heretics. These manuals assumed the existence of heretical doctrine and instructed inquisitors on how to elicit confessions that conformed to predefined templates. The interrogation process often involved leading questions, threats, and demands for denunciation of others. The result was a cascade of confessions, many of which were shaped more by the expectations of the inquisitor than the beliefs of the accused. These texts became the foundational sources for later histories of heretical movements. Embedding distortion at the point of origin, the language used to describe heresy was itself part of the rewriting. Heretics were labeled with terms that dehumanized them: dogs, vermin, spawn of the devil. Their actions were framed as subversive, conspiratorial, and sexually deviant, regardless of actual behavior. This language served to disqualify them not only from religious legitimacy, but from historical subjectivity. Their marginalization was total spiritual, social, and historiographical. The result is that, in the canonical archive, heresy exists less as a theological category than as a rhetorical tool of exclusion. Visual representation further reinforced these distortions. Illuminated manuscripts and ecclesiastical art portrayed heretics being devoured by beasts, burned alive, or mocked by demons. These images were not illustrations of historical fact. They were instruments of moral persuasion, designed to create an emotional association between dissent and damnation. As with written sources, the visual archive was curated to ensure that the memory of heresy was inseparable from its condemnation. The process of rewriting did not end with suppression. In some cases, doctrines attributed to heretics were appropriated, modified, and reintroduced under new guises. Elements of Cathar cosmology found echoes in later mystical traditions. Aspects of Waldensian lay spirituality influenced Reformation thought. Yet in each case, the origins were obscured. The institutional church absorbed select elements while erasing the lineage, ensuring that the genealogy of dissent was broken and disconnected from its roots. This pattern complicates the historical record. When scholars cite inquisitorial reports, ecclesiastical decrees, or heresy trials, they are working with sources that were created for purposes of control, not comprehension. The documents do not present heresy as it was lived or believed, but as it needed to be depicted in order to be destroyed. This distinction is not merely academic. It affects how religious history is understood, how theological innovation is traced, and how resistance is remembered or forgotten. Even where historical revisionism is possible, it remains partial. The destruction of primary materials, the loss of oral traditions, and the overwhelming weight of institutional documentation make full recovery of heretical voices improbable. Yet the very absence, the gaps in the record, and the formulaic nature of surviving accusations reveal the architecture of suppression. Heresy was not merely persecuted, it was reconstructed, renamed, and recast to serve the narrative needs of dominant institutions. In examining how medieval intelligence networks and ecclesiastical structures contributed to the rewriting of history. The case of heresy is fundamental. It shows how entire belief systems could be neutralized, not only through physical violence, but through epistemological obliteration. The control of narrative, who speaks, how they are represented, and what is remembered, was a core function of power. In this sense, heretics did not lose simply because they were militarily defeated or theologically out-argued. They were written out of history, reconstructed as shadows of what they may have been, and consigned to the margins of an archive that spoke with only one voice. The illusion of comprehensiveness in historical archives is among the most persistent and least examined assumptions in modern scholarship. The existence of preserved documents, neatly catalogued manuscripts, and codified chronicles creates an impression of completeness that belies the structural gaps embedded in the record. These are not merely the result of time, accident, or decay. They are often the product of intentional omission, targeted destruction, or the non-recording of inconvenient information. The absence of material is not an anomaly in the historical process. It is integral to it. This is especially true in the medieval period, when documentation was a scarce and selective process governed by institutional agendas. To understand what medieval archives contain, one must examine what they do not and why those silences persist. Absence manifests in multiple forms. Entire events unrecorded, figures erased from genealogies, documents noted but never found, or volumes known to have existed yet lacking any trace in subsequent inventories. In many cases, references in extant documents hint at prior correspondence, earlier versions, or lost treatises that would significantly alter our understanding of the context. Royal letters refer to previous agreements with no surviving copies. Papal bulls cite decrees whose originals have vanished. Chroniclers mention speeches, meetings, or edicts that left no record beyond their passing mention. These lacunae are not random. Their patterns often correspond with political crises, doctrinal shifts, or regime changes, moments when controlling memory became essential to consolidating power. Church archives are especially susceptible to these patterns. Episcopal registers, for instance, are often continuous until a period of heresy, excommunication, or local rebellion, then resume with gaps, redactions, or suspicious conciseness. Inquisitorial records show similar distortions. Some heresy trials are documented in minute detail, while others are recorded only in general terms, with vague summaries or missing testimonies. In many cases, this discrepancy correlates with the social status of the accused, or the political sensitivity of the outcome. High-ranking clergy accused of heretical leanings, for example, often have their trials documented in sanitized form. If at all, the decision not to record, or to record selectively, was an act of strategic silence. Monastic libraries also reveal this architecture of absence. Catalogs from medieval monasteries often list titles that no longer exist in the collection, and for which no known copies survive. The loss may have occurred through fire, looting, or decay, but in some instances, the disappearance aligns with doctrinal purges or administrative reform. Libraries aligned with reformist or heterodox movements were more likely to suffer losses in subsequent orthodox reconsolidation efforts. Manuscripts associated with condemned theologians were often singled out for destruction, with only marginal notes or citations in hostile texts bearing witness to their prior existence. Royal and civic archives likewise show selective discontinuity. Municipal records during periods of revolt or foreign occupation frequently omit reference to collaborators, controversial decrees, or unpopular rulers. Once political control shifted, records were edited to reflect the new regime's legitimacy. The erasure of entire councils, rewritings of dynastic succession, or deliberate loss of financial ledgers indicate a policy of narrative engineering through archival management. The physical loss of documents in these cases is inseparable from the political intention behind that loss. Archives, far from being passive repositories, were active instruments in the shaping of public memory. There's also a subtler form of archival absence, non-inclusion. In the medieval world, vast areas of human experience were simply not considered worthy of documentation. Peasant revolts, women's contributions, folk customs, and non-Latin intellectual traditions were largely unrecorded unless they entered the field of elite anxiety as threats to orthodoxy or order. Oral traditions were not transcribed unless appropriated by ecclesiastical authorities. Local histories were often subsumed into larger, more centralized chronicles that erased regional particularities. These absences create a skewed perception of what constituted importance in the medieval worldview, reinforcing the dominance of elite, male, and clerical perspectives. The mechanisms that reinforced these absences included institutional policies, scribal conventions, and material constraints. Monks were trained to copy certain kinds of texts, not others. Scribes prioritized canon law over folk chronicles, patristic theology over heterodox speculation. Storage space, parchment availability, and copying labor were limited, necessitating selective preservation. Decisions about what to copy or exclude were rarely neutral. They reflected prevailing ideologies, resource allocation, and risk avoidance. In a world where heresy could be lethal, preserving the wrong book could be seen as complicity. Moreover, some absences were constructed after the fact. Retrospective redaction, a practice in which earlier documents were edited to conform with later orthodoxy, further complicates the archive. A manuscript copied in the 14th century from a 12th century original may contain silent alterations, erasing earlier heterodox nuances. These adjustments, unmarked and undated, make it nearly impossible to reconstruct the original text. The chain of transmission is thus not only fragile, but tampered with at multiple points, each omission building upon the last dot. In rare cases, the architecture of absence becomes visible. The Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books, updated regularly from the 16th century onward, provides indirect evidence of works once circulating, but later deemed unacceptable. While many of these texts were printed in the early modern period, some have medieval origins or preserve earlier material. Their banning implies previous presence, even where no copies survive. Similarly, catalogs from private collections or university libraries occasionally list now lost works, providing tantalizing glimpses of intellectual constellations that have since disappeared. The problem of archival absence is compounded by modern historiographical practice. Scholars trained to privilege documentary evidence often underrepresent periods or regions where documentation is thin or contradictory. This reinforces a feedback loop. What is well documented is studied, cited, and canonized. What is missing is ignored, deemed marginal or speculative. The institutionalization of this logic further marginalizes voices and events already suppressed by medieval mechanisms of control. Absence, then, is not avoided, is a presence of constraint, a signal of prior intervention. The archival record does not merely show us what the past was like. It reveals what past institutions wanted the future to believe. The gaps are not accidental. They are diagnostic. They point to conflicts, fears, and priorities that were deemed too dangerous, too ambiguous, or too destabilizing to be preserved. In approaching medieval history through this lens, historians must adopt a dual strategy: engage critically with what is present while also interrogating what is missing. This means reading between documents, comparing parallel sources, and considering the institutional context of preservation. It means asking not only what is said, but who had the power to say it and who did not. Only by acknowledging the architecture, Of absence can we begin to understand the true contours of historical memory in the medieval period. Codification, the process of systematically organizing laws, doctrines, and procedures into formal documents, was a hallmark of medieval institutional power. From ecclesiastical decrees to royal charters and urban statutes, codified texts served not merely to preserve information, but to assert control, define legitimacy, and eliminate ambiguity. The emergence of codex culture, replacing scrolls and oral traditions with bound volumes arranged for systematic access, marked a profound shift in the management of knowledge and authority. This transformation extended beyond format. It was epistemological, architectural, and political. Codification was not neutral, it was a means of constraining interpretation, standardizing behavior, and consolidating control over both present action and future memory. In ecclesiastical contexts, codification took the form of canon law collections, liturgical books, and theological summas. Gratian's Decretum, compiled in the 12th century, became the foundational text of medieval canon law. It sought to resolve contradictions among earlier papal rulings, conciliar decrees, and writings of church fathers. In doing so, it created a framework that would guide clerical conduct, court decisions, and ecclesiastical governance for centuries. Yet the very act of harmonizing prior inconsistencies required judgment, selection, and suppression. Gratian and his successors chose which sources to prioritize, which contradictions to acknowledge, and which to ignore. Apparent consistency was achieved not through impartial synthesis, but through strategic omission and interpretive framing. This method of codification was subsequently reinforced by papal decretals, letters from the Pope that became authoritative once included in official collections. These decretals were selectively compiled, edited, and disseminated in volumes such as the Liber Extra of Gregory IX. Each edition presented itself as an unbroken line of authoritative teaching, yet its composition was the result of decisions about what to include, how to phrase it, and how to fit new pronouncements into older frameworks. As these texts circulated across Europe, they reshaped local ecclesiastical practices to conform with central authority. Dissenting interpretations, alternative traditions, and local legal customs were gradually marginalized or suppressed. Secular rulers adopted similar strategies. Legal codices such as the Siete Partidas in Castile, the Assizes of Jerusalem in the Crusader states, or the Capitularies of the Carolingians, aimed to consolidate royal power by presenting laws as fixed, coherent, and universally applicable. These texts often claimed continuity with ancient traditions, even when the content was newly invented or selectively derived. Legal historians have documented numerous cases where so-called customary law was codified in ways that contradicted actual local practice, replacing lived legal pluralism with abstracted and enforceable norms favorable to ruling authorities. Urban centers also engaged in codification. City statutes, guild regulations, and commercial codes were compiled into written collections that governed trade, taxation, and civic conduct. These compilations gave the appearance of participatory governance, but in reality, they were often produced by elite councils or external powers seeking to impose order. The written nature of these codes made them resistant to oral reinterpretation or communal negotiation. Once inscribed, the law became a fixed object resistant to amendment, detached from its origins and enforceable through coercive means. The codex format itself facilitated these developments. Unlike scrolls or oral traditions, codices allowed for indexing, cross-referencing, and marginal annotation. This enabled greater control over how knowledge was accessed and interpreted. A cleric consulting a codex of canon law could be directed to a specific ruling, framed by authoritative commentary and surrounded by confirmatory citations. The format discouraged alternative readings, improvisation, or deviation. It created a textual architecture of command, embedded in the very layout of the page, Scholasticism, the dominant intellectual mode of the high medieval period, reinforced this logic. The methodical structuring of questions, objections, and resolutions, as exemplified in the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, mirrored legal codification. Every assertion was bracketed, debated, and resolved within a framework that emphasized clarity, coherence, and deference to authority. Scholastic texts were often written in codex form, cross-referenced with canon law, and integrated into university curricula. The result was an intellectual environment in which deviation from established interpretations was not merely discouraged but structurally precluded. Codification also affected the transmission of history. Chronicles and annals were increasingly structured around royal reigns, papal tenures, or ecclesiastical events, creating a framework in which time itself was organized according to institutional priorities. Dates were aligned with the liturgical calendar. Historical causality was attributed to divine will or official policy, and historical actors were judged according to their conformity with codified ideals. This standardization of historical narrative made it easier to integrate the past into the present legal and moral order. It also made it harder to recover suppressed episodes, dissenting voices, or non-conforming traditions. The process of codification was supported by material investment. Scriptoria devoted significant resources to copying and disseminating codified texts, often under the patronage of bishops, abbots, or monarchs. Libraries reorganized their holdings around canonical collections, displacing miscellaneous or local writings. Universities structured their curricula around codified materials, training future clerics, judges, and officials to think within these frameworks. The result was not only a centralized archive, but a centralized mentality and institutional habit of mind that equated codification with truth. Critically, codification did not always reflect consensus. In many cases, resistance was suppressed through legal or ecclesiastical pressure. Alternative interpretations of doctrine or law proposed by regional councils, monastic reformers, or lay theologians were deemed invalid unless incorporated into the official codices. This marginalization was not simply intellectual. It had concrete consequences. Those who taught or practiced outside the codified frameworks could be excommunicated, prosecuted, or silenced. The authority of the codex became a surrogate for divine or royal will, and contesting it became indistinguishable from rebellion. The long-term effect of this codified architecture has been to shape not only medieval society, but modern historiography. Contemporary scholars, reliant on the preserved legal and theological codices, often replicate the exclusions embedded within them. What was omitted, redacted, or never recorded remains invisible unless painstakingly reconstructed through comparative analysis or inferred from hostile sources. The codex, in this sense, was both a medium of preservation and a mechanism of By examining the rise of codification as a strategic tool, it becomes clear that medieval institutions did not merely document the world they structured. It threw texts that defined what was true, legal, and acceptable. Codices did not simply reflect power, they enacted it. They imposed coherence where there was conflict, continuity where there was rupture, and legitimacy where there was innovation. The appearance of historical order they provided was achieved through the exclusion of all that could not be codified, an exclusion that continues to shape our understanding of the medieval past. The Crusades are frequently analyzed as military campaigns, theological expressions of zeal, or cultural encounters between East and West. However, they also functioned as potent mechanisms for narrative control, strategic disruptions that reset historiographical trajectories, erased inconvenient political legacies, and redefined religious boundaries. In their wake, the Crusades not only altered the physical map of the medieval world, but restructured its memory, suppressing certain historical continuities while elevating newly crafted identities. These were not unintentional byproducts. The violence, displacement, and redrawing of borders that accompanied the Crusades were accompanied by a parallel process of documentary manipulation and historical reorientation. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, launched under papal direction, provides a foundational case. The original rationale liberating Christian holy sites and aiding Byzantine Christians was embedded within a framework of spiritual justification. But this framework was rapidly transformed into a tool for narrative monopolization. Chronicles such as the Gesta Francorum, Historia Ierosolimitana, and the writings of Fulcher of Chartres did more than record events. They created a new genre of sacred history in which military conquest was cast as divine will, suffering as purification, and enemies as metaphysical evil. These texts, disseminated in ecclesiastical and noble circles, provided the template for interpreting subsequent events, making dissent or alternative explanation structurally illegible. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was presented not as a violent massacre, which it was by any objective measure, but as a sanctified culmination of divine promise. The slaughter of Jews and Muslims, the looting of sacred spaces, and the desecration of urban infrastructure were omitted, minimized, or reframed. The intentional destruction of local archives, Islamic Waqf records, and synagogue manuscripts during the conquest further ensured that the only surviving narrative would be the one crafted by the victors. This control over documentation was strategic, allowing the Latin Church to inscribe the conquest as a spiritual milestone, while eliminating counter-evidence of collaboration, shared religious spaces, or diplomatic negotiation. Subsequent crusades repeated and refined this pattern. The Fourth Crusade 1202–1204, which culminated in the sack of Constantinople, exemplifies the use of military action as a narrative reset. The Byzantine Empire, an older, more literate, and deeply Christian civilization, was recast as decadent, heretical, and politically illegitimate. Latin chroniclers portrayed the conquest as the purification of a corrupted church, even as crusaders plundered libraries, destroyed churches, and desecrated relics. Byzantine records, which could have offered a counter-narrative, were scattered or destroyed. The conquest fractured Orthodox Christianity and allowed the Latin Church to reframe ecclesiastical history as culminating in Western supremacy, conveniently eliminating centuries of theological and imperial complexity. The crusading movement's impact extended beyond the battlefield and into domestic governance. Monarchs used participation in crusades to legitimize their rule, consolidate internal authority, and rebrand domestic conflicts as extensions of sacred war. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209–1229, against the Cathars in southern France was not directed at foreign enemies but at a regional population that challenged both ecclesiastical orthodoxy and Capetian centralization. The Crusades' outcome, military occupation, forced conversion, and inquisitorial control, was accompanied by a systematic rewriting of regional history. Occitan literature, legal customs, and theological independence were suppressed. Chronicles that survived this period reflect the victor's view that southern France had always been rebellious, heretical, and in need of reform. Earlier records suggesting a vibrant, pluralistic culture were largely erased or altered. The narrative reset function of crusades was supported by official church documentation. Papal bulls, sermons, and council decrees retroactively justified actions taken during crusades, even when they contradicted earlier policies or diplomatic arrangements. The shifting definition of crusade, expanding from the Holy Land to internal enemies, rival Christian states, and even pagans in the Baltic, was mirrored by a corresponding expansion in the historiographical scope of crusading. This allowed the Church to retrospectively incorporate unrelated conflicts into a unified theological narrative, thereby simplifying complex geopolitical developments into a single arc of divine mission. legal mechanisms reinforced this process. Crusaders were often granted immunity from lawsuits, suspension of debts, and indulgences privileges that elevated their actions above normal juridical scrutiny. These exemptions meant that actions taken during crusades were rarely documented. In the same way as ordinary affairs, looted property, seized land, and confiscated texts could disappear into private or ecclesiastical hands without formal record. In cases where documentation did exist, it often lacked the detail or neutrality required for historical reconstruction. This created a documentary asymmetry. The justifications for crusades were carefully recorded and preserved, while the abuses, contradictions, and failures were fragmented or suppressed. Another crucial element of the narrative reset was the creation of relics and sites of memory. Crusaders returned with artifacts, bones, and fragments of sacred buildings, many of dubious origin, which were then incorporated into churches and shrines across Europe. These relics were not neutral souvenirs, they were incorporated into local liturgies, hagiographies, and municipal identities. The cities that housed them often rewrote their own histories to incorporate the presence of these objects, creating fictive genealogies that linked them to biblical events or apostolic missions. These narratives displaced older histories, local traditions, and non-conforming religious practices, replacing them with crusade-inflected identities. Intellectual culture also absorbed the crusading paradigm. Scholastic theologians, chroniclers, and legal theorists developed arguments to justify permanent war against infidels, heretics, and even non-Catholic Christians. Figures like Bernard of Clairvaux and Raymond of Penafort wrote extensively to frame the Crusades not as responses to specific provocations, but as necessary features of a world divided between truth and error. This framing narrowed the range of acceptable political and theological discourse. Those who questioned the necessity, morality, or consequences of the Crusades were marginalized or accused of complicity with the enemy. The result was an ideological environment in which history could be revised without resistance, because alternatives were rendered both dangerous and invisible. The suppression of dissenting voices during and after the Crusades was systemic. Letters opposing crusades, eyewitness accounts of atrocities, and local records contradicting official versions were rarely copied, cited, or preserved. When such materials survived, it was often through accidental preservation in private collections or foreign archives. Even then, they were frequently ignored by later chroniclers who relied on ecclesiastical compilations or royal histories. The centralization of manuscript production in cathedral schools and monastic houses, aligned with crusade sponsors, ensured that only certain perspectives were reproduced and disseminated. Ultimately, the Crusades functioned as more than religious wars. They were episodes of enforced historiographical transformation, during which past narratives were deleted, existing structures dismantled, and new, institutionally sanctioned histories imposed. These resets were not incidental, they were designed. The erasure of regional autonomy, theological plurality, and pre-existing cross-cultural interaction made way for a simplified binary worldview. This binary, in turn, justified continued violence, ecclesiastical expansion, and the consolidation of memory under the aegis of the Latin Church. In the study of medieval intelligence and historical manipulation, the Crusades must be recognized, not only for their geopolitical impact, but for their role in manufacturing historical discontinuity. They were not merely events. They were instruments deployed to sever inconvenient pasts and inscribe new, authorized ones in their place. The echoes of these narrative resets persist, shaping how medieval history is taught, remembered, and contested to this day. The transition from oral to written culture in medieval Europe was neither uniform nor merely technological. It was ideological. As Latin literacy expanded under ecclesiastical and royal institutions, the written word became a gatekeeper for authority, legitimacy, and historical continuity. The process of textualization, the recording, codifying, and institutional storing of previously oral traditions did not simply preserve memory. It filtered it. Oral knowledge systems, which had long governed social organization, local law, religious practice, and collective identity, were subordinated to literate authority. This shift enabled a profound reconfiguration of who could speak, what counted as truth, and how history could be structured. In this transformation, literacy was not neutral. It was weaponized. Oral societies depend on collective memory, performative reiteration, and communal reinforcement. Authority is fluid, negotiated, and anchored in repetition. But as writing becomes dominant, especially under hierarchical regimes, control over textual production translates into control over interpretive frameworks. The shift is not merely one of medium, it is a transformation in the architecture of power. Writing freezes versions, stabilizes ideologies, and excludes dissenting alternatives that lack documentation. In medieval Europe, those who could write and read Latin, primarily clerics, acquired the power to define doctrine, record law, and inscribe history, while those outside this class lost narrative visibility. The mechanisms of this shift are observable in legal culture. Before widespread codification, customary law was orally transmitted within communities, interpreted flexibly by local elders or judges. These laws were pluralistic, responsive to context, and varied by region. As kings and bishops began to impose written codes, these diverse legal traditions were either absorbed in reduced form or erased altogether. The act of writing law did not simply record practice, it redefined it. Royal charters, ecclesiastical decrees, and urban statutes claimed universality, retroactively imposing order where there had been fluid negotiation. This textual imposition rendered oral law unofficial, unrecorded, and thus ultimately dismissible. Similar patterns appeared in religious life. Prior to full ecclesiastical domination, religious practice in many communities combined Christian liturgy with local customs, seasonal festivals, and inherited ritual forms. These were transmitted orally, maintained through folk memory, and mediated through storytelling, pilgrimage, and communal enactment. As the Church asserted control, it began to regulate liturgical practice through missals, breviaries, and sacramentaries, books that delineated the precise words and gestures for worship. Deviations from these standardized texts, even when rooted in long-standing oral tradition, came to be labeled as superstition, error, or heresy. Thus, the codified liturgy displaced local expressions of faith, making the written word the arbiter of religious correctness. The dominance of Latin as the language of literacy further deepened the exclusionary impact of textualization. Local vernaculars spoken by the vast majority of the population were rarely used in formal writing until the late medieval period. Ecclesiastical authorities deliberately maintained Latin as a linguistic barrier, ensuring that access to texts, records, and scripture was confined to trained elites. Even when vernacular religious texts began to circulate, they were frequently condemned as heretical or unauthorized. The fear was not merely doctrinal impurity, but the loss of interpretive control. Illiterate laity threatened the monopoly of clerical mediation. The educational system reinforced this structure. Monasteries and cathedral schools trained select individuals in the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic alongside theology and canon law. These disciplines were not simply intellectual exercises. They were tools for producing ideologically reliable interpreters of the written archive. Students were taught not only how to read and write, but how to align their interpretations with ecclesiastical orthodoxy. As universities emerged in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, they extended this framework, training clerics and jurists who would go on to produce, preserve, and enforce the textual order. One result of this literate regime was the archival eclipse of oral cultures. Entire bodies of knowledge, botanical, astronomical, medicinal, juridical, theological previously passed through oral transmission were either absorbed into written form with significant alteration or rendered illegitimate. The process of transcription was selective. Scribes chose what to write down based on perceived utility, orthodoxy, and institutional approval. The oral epistemologies of women, peasants, and non-Christian communities were particularly vulnerable. Their knowledge remained unrecorded unless appropriated, often anonymously, into larger compilations. What was not written was not cited. What was not cited became invisible. The consequences extended into historical writing. Chronicles, annals, and saints' lives privileged literate actors, kings, bishops, martyrs, scholars whose deeds were already being documented. Oral accounts of communal resistance, local miracles, or ancestral genealogies were either excluded or refashioned through the lens of written norms. In some cases, oral traditions were ridiculed as folklore, reduced to exoticism, or strategically appropriated to enhance the prestige of dominant groups. The historical canon that emerged was thus deeply skewed, privileging what was documented in Latin over what was remembered in song, ritual, or testimony. Resistance to this transition did occur, but it was structurally constrained. In some regions, local languages were used to compose vernacular epics, legal codes, and theological reflections. Yet these efforts were often marginalized by ecclesiastical censors or subordinated to Latin compilations. The Sachsenspiegel, an early German law book written in the vernacular, was subject to ecclesiastical suspicion. The Chanson de Roland and other chansons de geste, though reflective of oral heritage, were absorbed into nationalistic or crusading narratives. These adaptations demonstrate that even when oral traditions entered written form, they did so on terms set by the literate elite. Women's roles in oral knowledge transmission were especially vulnerable. Women served as midwives, healers, ritual specialists, and custodians of familial memory roles that often went unrecognized in written documentation. As medicine was professionalized through university training and medical texts, women's empirical knowledge was disqualified as unscientific or dangerous. The process of marginalization was amplified by ecclesiastical suspicion. Female healers were increasingly portrayed as witches and their oral practices as diabolical. Without literacy, institutional support, or textual recognition, their voices were systematically erased. Literacy also enabled new forms of surveillance. Written records, censuses, tax rolls, tithe registers, inquisitorial depositions allowed rulers and clerics to monitor populations with greater precision. These documents were used to assess compliance, extract resources, and target deviants. Oral cultures, which had maintained a degree of opacity through decentralization and performative flexibility, found themselves exposed to archival fixation. Once inscribed, an accusation, confession, or legal status became fixed and circulatable. Individuals were no longer judged solely by community memory, but by written records controlled by distant authorities. In this context, the archive became an instrument of discipline. Its contents shaped future decisions, restricted memory, and imposed uniformity. Literacy was no longer merely a skill, it was a gatekeeping function, an instrument of epistemological policing. Those who could not access or influence the written archive were structurally silenced. Their histories became illegible, their claims unenforceable, their beliefs untransmissible beyond the local and the ephemeral. The weaponization of literacy did not require malice. It was embedded in institutional logics that privileged fixity over fluidity, hierarchy over reciprocity, and standardization over plurality. Yet its impact was no less severe. The transition from oral to written reordered the medieval world, not only in what was recorded, but in who could remember, who could speak, and who could be heard. The medieval period witnessed the emergence and proliferation of groups that operated in secrecy, outside or alongside the conventional structures of state and ecclesiastical authority. These groups have often been categorized under the ambiguous rubric of secret societies, a label that evokes images of clandestine rituals, hidden symbols, and obscure agendas. Yet such a classification obscures more than it reveals. Many of these entities functioned not in opposition to the state, but in tacit alignment with its objectives. Their secrecy was not necessarily a mark of subversion. In many cases, it was a method of operational efficiency and institutional control. The boundary between secret society and state apparatus was not distinct. It was porous, shifting, and often indistinguishable. The Templars, for instance, are frequently cited as a paradigmatic secret society. Their rituals, restricted membership, and autonomous infrastructure gave rise to numerous legends. But their operational reality was deeply embedded within the broader political-theological complex of medieval Christendom. Created with papal approval, granted special legal immunities, and entrusted with financial and military responsibilities across multiple kingdoms, the Templars functioned as an extraterritorial branch of ecclesiastical authority. Their internal secrecy, ritual initiation, confidential communication, controlled archives was a mechanism to protect information, enforce discipline, and standardize operations across dispersed territories. It served institutional goals, not ideological subversion. The Hospitallers followed a similar trajectory. Initially founded for charitable and medical purposes, they evolved into a military and diplomatic entity with quasi-sovereign power. Their complex internal hierarchy, multilingual composition, and fiscal autonomy were all shielded from external scrutiny by layers of procedural opacity. They negotiated treaties, engaged in naval warfare, managed fortresses, and maintained extensive property registers, often operating with the implicit or explicit sanction of both church and crown. To describe them as a secret society is to misunderstand their structural function. They were a private bureaucracy serving public authority. The assassins, the Nizari Ismaili order, offer another instructive case. Their tactical secrecy, targeted assassinations, and network of fortified enclaves positioned them as an archetypal clandestine group. Yet their political role within Islamic polities was more complex. They formed strategic alliances, entered into diplomatic negotiations, and maintained long-term intelligence operations not as external threats, but as intra-system actors. Their secrecy was a necessary mode of survival in a hostile sectarian environment, but it also allowed them to exert influence disproportionate to their size. Their destruction by the Mongols did not discredit their methods. Rather, it underscored the power of asymmetric operations within a decentralized political landscape. Beyond these well-known cases, there existed lesser documented groups, mercantile consortia, esoteric guilds, lay confraternities that combined secrecy with institutional alignment. Merchant associations often maintained confidential ledgers, encrypted communications, and private arbitration protocols. Their control over trade routes and financial flows gave them leverage in both local and transnational politics. Urban guilds regulated access to skills, markets, and apprenticeships through oaths, rituals, and concealed knowledge. These mechanisms ensured quality control and protected economic interests, but they also formed parallel structures of governance that could rival municipal or royal authority. Lay religious movements such as the Beguines and Beghards operated in ambiguous spaces, neither fully monastic nor fully lay. They often developed spiritual practices outside official liturgical frameworks. Their communities were scrutinized for unregulated interpretation of scripture, gender nonconformity, and economic independence. Though not inherently subversive, their very autonomy was seen as threatening. Inquisitorial authorities subjected them to interrogation, not because of doctrinal deviation alone, but because of their resistance to incorporation into codified ecclesiastical structures. Their semi-secrecy was a defense against institutional absorption, not an offensive strategy. In some cases, the very act of organizing in secrecy was prompted by the failures or coercions of state power. Crypto-Jewish communities in Iberia, following forced conversions and inquisitorial surveillance, developed sophisticated systems of private worship, ritual concealment, and oral transmission. Their secrecy was not ideological but existential. Similarly, early reformist networks, proto-Protestant thinkers like the Lollards or Hussites, circulated texts in clandestine fashion, held underground meetings, and employed coded language to evade detection. While later characterized as dangerous radicals, their initial secrecy emerged from a context in which open dissent invited immediate persecution. State and ecclesiastical authorities recognized both the utility and threat of these formations. In some instances, they tolerated secrecy as long as it remained functionally supportive. Royal agents employed secret informants, commissioned covert missions, and issued sealed instructions. The Church dispatched legates with discretionary powers, circulated confidential reports, and maintained secret archives. These were not marginal acts. They were core components of governance. Secrecy was instrumentalized as a method of discretion, negotiation, and crisis management. What distinguished legitimate secrecy from illegitimate clandestinity was often a matter of allegiance, not method. The functional overlap between clandestine groups and official institutions is perhaps most evident in the use of archives. Many so-called secret societies kept detailed records, financial logs, correspondence, initiation rosters, operational reports. These were not hidden out of criminal intent, but to protect internal coherence and strategic autonomy. Similarly, ecclesiastical and royal authorities maintained secret registers, withheld documents from public view, and authorized selective dissemination. The secrecy of record was not a sign of marginality, it was a structural norm. The historiographical challenge lies in distinguishing between actual secrecy and perceived secrecy. Many groups that operated in limited transparency were labeled secret by hostile observers, even when their internal procedures mirrored those of state institutions. The rhetoric of secrecy became a political weapon. Accusations of clandestine activity justified suppression, legitimized surveillance, and bolstered public narratives of moral clarity. The very concept of the secret society served a strategic purpose. It allowed authorities to frame dissent, autonomy, or nonconformity as inherently suspicious, regardless of actual behavior. This dynamic complicates modern readings of medieval sources. Historians relying on ecclesiastical or royal records must account for the ways in which secrecy was framed, deployed, and misunderstood. The label of secret often masks a more nuanced reality, one in which operational discretion, institutional protection, and strategic opacity were necessary responses to unstable or hostile environments. The language of secrecy, in other words, tells us more about the anxieties of dominant institutions than about the intentions of the groups so labeled. In evaluating whether certain medieval groups were secret societies or state apparatuses, the answer may be that they were both. Their secrecy was not antithetical to authority. It was part of how authority was exercised, protected, and expanded. The boundary between clandestine and official was fluid, negotiated, and often deliberately obscured. Recognizing this permeability is essential to understanding how medieval power functioned, not only in open decrees and visible institutions, but in shadows, margins, and the quiet rooms where records were kept, rituals enacted, and strategies devised away from public scrutiny. The medieval historical record, often assumed to be a product of faithful transmission, contains within it a substratum of forgery and fabrication that shape perceptions of legitimacy, authority, and continuity. These were not isolated cases of individual deception, but systemic practices embedded within ecclesiastical, royal, and legal institutions. Forgery, in this context, was not always hidden. It was sometimes brazen, operating under the assumption that the appearance of antiquity or the absence of contradiction was sufficient to establish truth. Fabricated documents, invented genealogies, and forged charters played a foundational role in constructing the historical narratives of both church and state. One of the most infamous forgeries in Western history is the Donation of Constantine, purportedly written by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. It granted temporal authority over the Western Roman Empire to the Bishop of Rome, cited throughout the Middle Ages as justification for papal supremacy. It was incorporated into major collections of canon law and used in political disputes to assert the Pope's primacy over secular rulers. The donation was eventually proven to be an 8th century forgery by Renaissance humanists like Lorenzo Valla, who applied philological analysis to expose its anachronisms and linguistic inconsistencies. Yet for centuries prior, its authority was unchallenged, not because it was unknown to be fabricated, but because it served institutional purposes too valuable to discard. This case is not unique. Medieval Europe was replete with forged charters, fabricated land grants, and spurious privileges. Monasteries often produced documents that proved their holdings dated back to ancient or royal donations, thus protecting them from taxation, appropriation, or jurisdictional encroachment. These forgeries were sometimes constructed with elaborate care using antique scripts, pseudo-Latin phrasing, and plausible historical references. They were copied into cartularies alongside authentic documents, creating a hybrid archive where truth and fiction coexisted with little distinction. Church councils, too, were retroactively granted authority through documentation that never existed at the time of their supposed meeting. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals, compiled in the 9th century, present themselves as letters and decrees from early popes and councils. In fact, they were constructed to bolster the authority of the Church against royal interference, asserting the independence of bishops and the supremacy of papal decrees. Though known to be forged, they were widely used in legal arguments throughout the medieval period. Their utility outweighed their authenticity. Genealogical fabrication played a parallel role in secular contexts. Noble families, in competition for land, titles, and royal favor, often commissioned documents that extended their lineage to mythical or legendary ancestors. These genealogies were recorded in family chronicles, hagiographies, and legal disputes. They provided not just prestige but legal standing, especially in succession crises or territorial claims. The Capetians, for example, linked their ancestry to Trojan heroes through literary invention, while other dynasties claimed descent from Charlemagne or biblical patriarchs. The purpose was not to deceive per se, but to establish an unassailable narrative of inherited legitimacy. Fabricated texts also served polemical purposes. Heretical groups were often attributed with doctrines they never professed, recorded in texts composed by their opponents. These pseudo-heretical writings, framed as proof of deviance, were then cited to justify persecution. Inquisitors relied on template confessions that conflated distinct movements, attributing uniformity to diverse dissenting traditions. These texts were not forged in the narrow sense of pretending to be something they were not. Rather, they were constructed fictions embedded within supposedly factual judicial proceedings. Their authority was institutional, not evidentiary. The production of fabricated relics likewise altered historical perception. Bones, garments, and objects attributed to saints, apostles, or biblical figures were produced, distributed, and venerated without serious scrutiny. The multiplication of true cross fragments, the proliferation of saint skulls, and the inconsistent localization of sacred sites created a religious landscape saturated with questionable authenticity. Yet these relics were not merely devotional tools. They shaped local identity, attracted pilgrimage traffic, and legitimated ecclesiastical claims over contested regions. Their presence altered the historical memory of places, inserting fictive pasts into the built environment. Forgery was also instrumental in constructing legal norms. Customary law, especially in regions where oral traditions persisted, was often retroactively written down by clerics or royal officials. In the process, older practices were selectively recorded, reframed, or invented outright. These codifications, once inscribed, took on the appearance of ancient and immutable norms. Legal historians have noted how feudal obligations, taxation rights, and manorial privileges were often based on documents that have no verifiable origin or are contradicted by earlier evidence. The reliance on such texts in court proceedings further institutionalized their authority. Importantly, fabrication in the medieval context was not always viewed as fraudulent. The distinction between truth and usefulness was blurred. A document that ought to exist because it supported what was believed to be right or just could be produced ex post facto and still considered legitimate. This teleological approach to documentation meant that forgers often operated with impunity, especially when their creations reinforced prevailing ideologies or served powerful patrons. As long as the document produced order, confirmed hierarchy, or prevented dispute, its origin was often irrelevant. Modern archival science and textual criticism have exposed many of these fabrications. Yet their historical influence remains embedded in the structures of law, property, theology, and national myth. The continuity of institutions that benefited from forged documents meant that even after exposure, the consequences were minimal. The forged donation of Constantine, for example, remained cited centuries after its debunking because it had already shaped canonical law and ecclesiastical memory. The presence of fabrication within the archive challenges the premise that historical legitimacy is derived from textual survival. It compels a re-evaluation of what constitutes evidence, what authority means in the face of known falsehoods, and how institutions navigate the tension between factual precision and narrative utility. It also raises questions about the intentions behind preservation. When archives protect forgeries, when libraries catalog fabricated texts as part of canon, and when historical scholarship continues to rely on compromised sources, the issue is not simply one of correction, but of complicity. Forgery in the medieval period was not marginal. It was foundational. It was a method by which power could produce its own credentials, retrospectively justify its claims, and suppress rival narratives through the construction of superior documentary evidence. In a world where the written word conferred authority, controlling that word regardless of its veracity became a central strategy. The medieval archive is thus a complex terrain where truth, invention, and institutional interest converge, and where the legitimacy of history itself was often authored in the shadows of fabrication. Forgery in the medieval period was not merely a matter of criminal deceit. It was a widespread and institutionally sanctioned practice used to construct authority, manufacture continuity, and revise memory. Modern notions of authenticity, rooted in archival rigor and documentary transparency, do not apply neatly to a world in which truth was often equated with theological orthodoxy, institutional stability, or dynastic need. In this context, forged documents, fabricated genealogies, and interpolated texts were not aberrations, but standard instruments of control. They served to reinforce claims, eliminate ambiguity, and shape historical consciousness to align with current power structures. The integrity of the medieval historical record, therefore, must be interrogated not only through what survives, but through the mechanisms by which much of it was deliberately constructed. Perhaps the most notorious instance of medieval forgery is the donation of Constantine, a fabricated imperial decree purportedly granting the Pope temporal authority over Rome and the Western Roman Empire. Widely accepted for centuries as genuine, this document was cited in papal bulls, canon law, and theological treatises to support the primacy of the Roman Church. Despite stylistic and linguistic anachronisms, its authority was rarely questioned. Until the Renaissance, when Lorenzo Valla famously exposed it as a forgery. The endurance of the donation reveals the institutional capacity not only to accept fabricated sources, but to integrate them seamlessly into legal and historical frameworks. It was not simply a forgery, it was a foundation. The donation was not an isolated case. Monastic communities frequently produced forged charters and land grants to assert property claims. These documents often bore the names of long-dead kings or bishops, and were written in plausible yet anachronistic script. They were stored in archives, cited in disputes, and used to justify expansions of authority. The practice became so widespread that entire scholarly fields, diplomatics and paleography, emerged to detect and analyze such forgeries, yet in many cases, these forgeries were never exposed in their own time. They were accepted not because they were believed to be true, but because they affirmed what was already institutionally desired. This pattern extended to the creation of false hagiographies, lives of saints written to promote local cults or reinforce ecclesiastical claims, often incorporated invented miracles, reattributed relics, and constructed martyrdoms. These texts serve to anchor a site's spiritual significance and attract pilgrimage revenue. In many cases, saints were discovered through dreams or visions, followed by the miraculous finding of bones or artifacts. The accompanying hagiographies would then retroactively create a biography, integrating the new saint into the broader narrative of Christian triumph. These lives were copied, cited, and eventually canonized into the liturgical calendar, despite their dubious origins. The textual apparatus of sanctity was as constructed as it was commemorative. Dynastic legitimacy was another domain shaped by fabrication. Genealogies were extended backward to link noble houses with legendary ancestors, biblical figures, or Roman emperors. These genealogical constructs were often enshrined in chronicles, visualized in illuminated manuscripts, and recited in legal proceedings. The aim was not historical accuracy, but narrative coherence, a story that justified present claims to land, title, or authority. Heraldic symbols, too, were retrospectively attributed to earlier ancestors to reinforce these stories. Once embedded in the archival and artistic record, these inventions became accepted components of the historical landscape. Ecclesiastical texts also. EXPERIENCED, interpolation, the insertion of new material into older documents. Church councils, for example, produced canons that were later edited, expanded, or reordered to align with evolving doctrine. Marginal notes became embedded in the body of texts. Footnotes became authoritative pronouncements, and oral interpretations were fixed in writing and retroactively attributed to ancient authorities. These textual layers are difficult to disentangle, especially when later manuscripts became the standard versions used in legal or theological debate. The result is a palimpsest in which the original document is obscured by cumulative fabrication. Even foundational theological texts were not immune. In several cases, letters attributed to church fathers such as Augustine or Jerome were discovered to be later compositions, designed to settle contemporary disputes by projecting authority backward. These pseudepigrapha were not merely literary exercises, they were tools of doctrinal enforcement. If a theological position could be shown to have ancient roots, its present legitimacy was strengthened. The fact that the roots were invented did not diminish their utility. Fabrication became a form of retrospective validation. The production of fabricated conciliar decrees served similar ends. In times of doctrinal crisis, councils or synods were retroactively created, complete with decrees, participants, and proceedings to suggest a longer lineage of orthodoxy than actually existed. These phantom councils were inserted into ecclesiastical histories, cited in canon law, and used to resolve disputes. Their very documentation made them real in the administrative sense, the act of writing conferred reality. Historical presence was achieved through textual assertion rather than empirical occurrence. The legal implications of forgery were not ignored, but the standards for evaluating authenticity differed radically from modern forensic expectations. Documents were often judged by their usefulness, plausibility, and alignment with orthodoxy. If a forged document supported a righteous cause, it was more likely to be accepted. Conversely, an authentic document that challenged authority could be dismissed, reinterpreted, or destroyed. The epistemology of trust was inverted. Fidelity was measured by conformity, not by origin. Archival practice facilitated this ambiguity. In many repositories, original documents were recopied periodically, with each iteration introducing potential changes. The loss of originals was common, whether through decay, theft, or intentional destruction. What remained were copies often made decades or centuries after the fact, bearing interpolations, updates, and redactions. Yet these copies became authoritative, particularly when stored in reputable institutions. The appearance of continuity was constructed through repeated transcription, not through unbroken preservation. Modern historiography has developed tools to detect forgery: stylometric analysis, paleographic scrutiny, material dating, but these tools are retrospective. For centuries, fabricated documents shaped political decisions, theological disputes, and public memory without contest. The stability of power depended on them. Their exposure in the modern period does not erase their historical efficacy. They were real in their consequences. Regardless of their fabrication, the existence of widespread forgery and fabrication undermines the notion that the medieval historical record is a mirror of past realities. Instead, it is a curated collection of texts that reflect institutional priorities, political calculations, and the strategic needs of legitimacy. The archive is not merely incomplete, it is engineered. The task of the historian is not only to uncover what happened, but to reconstruct the processes by which certain versions of events were manufactured, sanctified, and disseminated. In this context, medieval forgery is not a peripheral anomaly. It is central to understanding how truth was constructed, contested, and weaponized. The documents that remain are not simply records. They are artifacts of narrative control, instruments of institutional will. They do not tell us what was, they tell us what someone wanted us to believe had been. The accumulation of patterns, editorial manipulation in scriptoria, forged decrees, archival erasures, secret diplomacy, narrative resets via crusades, and the weaponization of literacy leads to a fundamental reassessment of the function of history in the medieval period. At issue is not whether individual facts were distorted or particular documents falsified. The more pressing concern is whether history itself, as recorded and transmitted, was structurally engineered to serve institutional purposes. To propose a theory of historical engineering is not to reduce all medieval historiography to conspiracy or fabrication. It is to examine how layered mechanisms, often bureaucratic, theological, and linguistic, were calibrated to control what could be known, what could be remembered, and what must be forgotten. Historical engineering differs from episodic falsification in both scope and intent. It is not the isolated act of an individual forging a document or interpolating a text. It is the cumulative effect of institutional policies, epistemological boundaries, and material practices that reshape the landscape of the past. It operates not through spectacle, but through structure, rules of access, protocols of validation, and hierarchies of interpretation. In the medieval context, this process was not hidden. It was systemic, administered through schools, courts, monasteries, chancelleries, and councils. Its tools were codices, sermons, legal compilations, and chronicles. Its agents were not necessarily conscious fabricators, but functionaries, executing normative routines within approved frameworks. At the core of this system is asymmetry. The asymmetry between those who produced records and those who were recorded. Between those who possessed literacy and those who did not. Between institutions with centralized archives and communities reliant on oral memory. The asymmetry was enforced by barriers to access, language, training, location, and authority. The Latin language acted as a filter. Ecclesiastical libraries. Limited entry. Scribal training reinforced orthodox templates. These structures ensured that only certain narratives could be documented, circulated, and canonized. The result was not an empty archive, it was a curated one, with silence operating as its foundational feature. This theory of historical engineering recognizes several interdependent vectors. The first is temporal projection, the retroactive. Attribution of authority, consistency, or lineage to current institutions by reshaping their recorded past. This was common in forged charters, fabricated genealogies, and retroscripted conciliar decrees. The second is narrative simplification, reducing complex theological, political, or cultural developments into binary oppositions, orthodox versus heretic, Christian versus infidel, civil order versus chaos. This flattening facilitated administrative clarity and moral certainty. The third is evidentiary filtering, preserving documents that reinforced institutional objectives while suppressing, redacting, or destroying those that undermined them. Combined, these processes functioned as an epistemic machine system of memory control embedded within the daily operations of medieval authority. The role of theology cannot be underestimated in this machinery. Medieval epistemology did not draw a sharp line between historical and theological truth. Events were interpreted through divine causality. Chronology was subordinated to eschatology. This sacralized worldview enabled institutions to frame historical engineering as spiritual obligation. Correcting the manuscript, eliminating a heretical doctrine, or rewriting a chronicle was not seen as distortion, it was seen as restoration, harmonization, or purification. The intent to preserve truth was frequently indistinguishable from the act of reshaping it. Theological conviction, therefore, served as both rationale and shield for epistemic control. The durability of this system rested on its integration with bureaucratic infrastructure. Chanceries maintained registers. Inquisitions preserved confessions. Universities standardized curricula. These were not merely sites of knowledge production, they were distribution nodes of approved history. Their documents moved through clerical networks, were read in sermons, cited in treatises, and taught in classrooms. Over generations, the repetition of engineered narratives created historical sediment layer upon layer of curated memory that obscured the original distortions. The authority of a given fact became proportional, not to its verifiability, but to its citation frequency within the institutional matrix. The result was an archive that projected coherence. It displayed continuity where rupture existed, uniformity where divergence had flourished. It produced a vision of the past that was legible to power and illegible to dissent. This vision shaped not only medieval self-understanding, but the frameworks inherited by modern historiography. Many of the assumptions about medieval Europe, its theological homogeneity, centralized institutional coherence, and unbroken traditions are artifacts of this engineered record. The dominance of certain narratives is not a reflection of their empirical prevalence, but of their archival survival. To assert a theory of historical engineering is not to claim that no authentic history exists from the medieval period. It is to assert that authenticity must be disentangled from legitimacy. That which was documented was not always what was dominant. That which was suppressed was not necessarily marginal. The scale of manipulation, both deliberate and procedural, requires a historiographical methodology that treats the archive not as a mirror, but as a mechanism, a technology of power designed to produce certain historical effects and erase others. Perspective invites a re-evaluation of historical methodology. Textual criticism, source triangulation, and material analysis remain essential, but they must be accompanied by structural diagnostics. Who controlled the archive? What were the incentives of the scribes? Where are the silences? What forms of knowledge were excluded by format, language, or ritual? These questions shift the focus from content to context, from text to transmission, from narrative to infrastructure. The theory also resists the temptation to locate blame in individuals. Most scribes, clerics, and officials operated within bounded horizons of expectation. They did not consider themselves falsifiers. They considered themselves stewards of order. The engineering was not always conscious. It was systemic, emergent, from routines that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. The integrity of the archive was not compromised by malice, but by obedience, yet the consequences were real. Alternative cosmologies, suppressed theologies, lost lineages, and erased communities disappeared from view. In their place, a curated canon was installed, reliable, reproducible, and institutionally secured. The cost of coherence was complexity. The price of continuity was truth. In sum, the medieval historical record must be understood not as a neutral inheritance, but as a construct shaped by power. Its gaps, distortions, and emphases are not incidental, they are engineered. Recognizing this fact does not render the past unknowable. It renders the process of knowing it more rigorous, more critical, and more attuned to the forces that sculpted the terrain of memory. Historical engineering was not an aberration of the medieval world. It was its condition of possibility. After tracing the arc of medieval knowledge control, from the mechanisms of monastic editing and inquisitorial filtering to the institutional production of memory through forgeries, codices, and narrative resets, it becomes clear that the historical record of the period is not an impartial reflection of what occurred. Rather, it is a heavily structured outcome of choices, some explicit, others embedded in institutional procedure. This final section is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It does not seek to summarize or resolve the previous investigations. Instead, it consolidates the evidence into a series of dossiers, discrete but interconnected domains where questions remain unresolved, sources remain inaccessible, and structures of secrecy still exert residual influence. The first dossier concerns missing texts. Across the corpus of ecclesiastical and royal archives, references persist to documents that no longer exist, lost conciliar decrees, vanished monastic rules, extinguished letters from dissenting theologians, absent versions of early biblical translations. The acknowledgement of these documents in surviving texts suggests their prior circulation, yet their disappearance implies either deliberate suppression or the structural neglect of materials deemed non-canonical. While some may attribute such losses to decay or accident, the patterned nature of these absences coinciding with doctrinal shifts, political realignments, or jurisdictional consolidation calls for a forensic reading of silence. These are not simply lost. They are erased. The second dossier pertains to documents that do survive, but are restricted. The Vatican archives, for instance, though increasingly accessible in certain periods, still hold entire series of documents, particularly relating to medieval inquisitions, missionary operations, and internal dissent, that remain classified, or available only to selected researchers. Their limited availability, coupled with the opaque procedures for access, raises the question of whether transparency is constrained by theological caution, political calculation, or the sheer inability to confront what the unredacted record might reveal. These archival black boxes are not empty. They are curated unknowns, protected under the logic of institutional self-preservation. The third dossier addresses the presence of known forgeries within the official record. Documents like the donation of Constantine, fabricated saints' lives, and pseudepigraphal letters continue to appear in collections and citations, despite their exposed falsehood. The refusal to systematically remove or annotate such documents, especially in ecclesiastical contexts, reflects an enduring attachment to their ideological function. Their status as useful fictions transforms them from anomalies into instruments of historical continuity. If forgery, once discovered, does not invalidate a claim but reinforces its symbolic necessity, then the boundary between historical truth and institutional need becomes irreversibly blurred. The fourth dossier concerns unresolved authorship. Many chronicles, legal texts, and theological compilations are attributed to known figures, but stylistic and structural analysis suggests composite authorship, later interpolation, or outright misattribution. The process of ascribing works to authorities such as Augustine, Jerome, or Isidore was often strategic. Authorship conferred legitimacy, especially when used to resolve doctrinal disputes. Yet in many cases, these attributions were unverified or based on tradition rather than manuscript evidence. This uncertainty challenges the reliability of even foundational texts and complicates any linear historiography based on their purported origin. A fifth dossier involves the role of linguistic translation and transformation. Latin served as the authoritative medium of textual transmission in the West. Yet many original texts, especially from Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and vernacular traditions, were mediated through selective and ideologically filtered translations. The transformation of meaning across languages, combined with the cultural filters of the translator, generated distortions that persist in the historical record. The choice of terms, the omission of explanatory context, and the restructuring of arguments reflect more than linguistic difficulty. They reflect epistemological policing. The source survives, but in a restructured form. What is translated is not always what was said. A sixth dossier relates to the operational secrecy of institutions themselves. Orders such as the Templars, Hospitallers, and later the Jesuits maintained internal protocols, classified communications, and inaccessible archives. The documentation they produced was never intended for public scrutiny. When such records were seized or exposed, as during the dissolution of the Templars, what surfaced were fragments, often filtered through hostile interrogations or judicial reconstructions. The actual administrative knowledge, ideological debates, and tactical decisions made within these organizations remain largely unknown. This institutional opacity has allowed both conspiratorial speculation and genuine historical uncertainty to persist. The final dossier is the philosophical one, the question of what it means to engage in historical inquiry under conditions of asymmetrical memory. If the record is engineered, if what survives is shaped by political, theological, and material priorities, then how can historical knowledge be reclaimed without reinforcing the structures that produced its distortions? Is it possible to reconstruct suppressed narratives from residual traces, counter-documents, and hostile accounts? Or does the framework itself, the archive, the codex, the canon preclude such recovery? These are not technical questions. They are foundational to the ethics of historiography. These dossiers do not offer closure. They indicate vectors of inquiry that remain open, often permanently so. The lack of conclusive evidence, the distortions of preservation, and the continued institutional control over key records create a terrain in which certainty is a methodological hazard, yet this should not be read as a call for relativism or cynicism. Rather, it is an invitation to reframe historical method as a critical encounter with power, absence, and representation. The script presented here has mapped the architecture of medieval secrecy across its many domains: monastic control of text, papal diplomacy, clandestine intelligence networks, narrative construction through crusade, codification as enforcement, and forgery as foundational myth. The evidence suggests not a singular plot, but a dense network of procedures and constraints by which history was manufactured. This does not negate the value of the medieval archive, but it demands that we treat it not as passive memory, but but as active production. The final question is not what the past was, but what the mechanisms of record have done to that past, and whether a new mode of inquiry, grounded in suspicion, critical reconstruction, and structural analysis, can begin to recover what was hidden, what was lost, and what was never meant to be seen.